We are good to go now.
Thank you very much. So I will call the meeting to order, and looking for a mover and a seconder from the committee for approval of the agenda. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Sanik. Thank you, Councillor Kiley. Any questions?
That includes the addendum as well, Mr. Chair.
Oh, yes. I always forget to say that. It also includes the addendum. If you haven't seen it, there's a couple of items on the addendum you can look up as well. So I will call the question, approval of the agenda. All those in favor? Thank you. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we do have one.
Mr. Chair, we need to approve the minutes.
Oh, right. Sorry, confirmation of minutes. I'm getting ahead of myself. From our May 28th meeting, and we all have a copy of that. Are there any corrections or questions regarding that? Seeing none, could we have a mover and a shaker for that confirmation? Councillor Hill, Councillor Hutchison. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. We do have one delegation tonight, and that's Ewan McKinnon. The floor is yours, Ewan. Just a reminder, you have 5 minutes, and then the committee has an opportunity to ask 2 questions. So the floor is yours.
Sorry, Mr. Neal, Councillor Neal. I'm just curious what I'm supposed to do here technically. I think they said I wasn't supposed to share my video and you'd all see the slideshow. Is that correct?
We'll ask our clerk that.
Mr. McKinnon, your video is on for your delegation. However, your slideshow will be appearing on the majority of the screen for most people. As you wish to advance the slide, just please let my colleague Derek know when you're ready to move forward.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So we're ready to go when you are.
Just if you just give me 1 second here. Okay, there. Sorry. Okay, I'm ready. Good evening. How's everybody been enjoying the beautiful weather lately? Over the past few months, while my family and I have been self-isolating at home, it's been very beneficial, both physically and mentally, to be able to get outside. We've been playing, gardening, and relaxing, having rediscovered the lost corners of our yard and are now using our space in new and different ways. This experience has given my family and I a newfound appreciation for our space. We watched spring come, the flowers poke up through the ground, and the trees becoming covered with leaves. We've enjoyed listening to the birds and the wonderful feeling of sunlight on our faces. I think this is something that is important to all residents. Wouldn't you agree? Looking at this proposed residence project from Queen's perspective, I can see how this space will be needed to accommodate additional first-year students and be a benefit to the university. However, for us, our tenants, and our neighbors, including the Queen's Daycare, we see the significant shadowing effects that will be cast by the resident onto sensitive areas. Derek, can you go to the next slide, please? As you can see in this animation created from the applicant's shadow study, the proposed residence will cause significant shadowing in front, side, and rear yards of properties along both Collingwood and Union Streets. While these vary throughout the year, in the winter period, when Kingston receives only 8 to 9 hours of sunlight per day, the new residence building will cast a shadow onto these sensitive areas, including residential amenity space and daycare play space, for 5 to 6 hours each day, leaving only a few unshadowed hours in these spaces during the darkest months of the year. This shadowing effect does not meet the performance criteria set out by the city that limits such impacts to a maximum of only 2 hours per day. The shadow will reach across Union Street to the north and across Collingwood Street to the west into adjacent residential neighborhoods with similar effect. We've taken the time to consider how the shadowing could be lessened, and although it would require some additional effort, there is an opportunity here to design a building that will be a net benefit for all parties, not a benefit to some at the cost of others. As you may already know, there's no minimum front yard setback at this location, and with Queen's recent purchase of 138 Albert Street immediately to the south, there's likely relief from the minimum side yard setback along the southern boundary. And herein lies an opportunity for the proposed building to be shifted south and east by 6 to 8 meters in both directions. The shifted location would reduce the shadowing effects on neighboring yards and play spaces. We have other various technical and legal concerns that we have shared with staff and members of the committee. In addition to those areas staff have identified as not yet fully assessed or diligenced. This evening, the planning committee is being asked to allow staff to work directly with the applicant to resolve the outstanding concerns noted in the report. However, I do not think these important discussions should happen behind closed doors. The plan should be fully developed and diligenced before this committee is asked to give its approval. I respectfully request that the planning committee defer the application until Queens has had the opportunity to clearly demonstrate that the proposed residence meets the city's performance standards. Thank you very much for your time. Derek, if you go to the last slide, it's just for questions.
Thank you. We'll go back to the committee if there are any questions, and we all have an opportunity on the committee to ask 2 questions. Are there any questions of the delegation? Seeing none.
Mr. Chair, I
Yes.
believe our Councillor Stroud has a question if no committee members do.
Okay, that's fine. Councillor Stroud, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. McKinnon, thanks for your submission. It was very clearly put. What you're asking for is that the decision not be made while there are a few loose ends, such as the feasibility of moving the project geographically a few meters to significantly decrease the shadowing effects on the neighboring properties, including your own. I would say that as the district councillor, having read many concerns from neighboring residents about the general massing and shadowing effects, I would say this is a reasonable suggestion. Can you just tell me what staff has told you when you've brought the matter up to them prior to tonight's meeting?
Thank you, Councillor Stroud, for your question. I did raise these concerns with planning staff, and what I was told was for various reasons, the residents didn't have to conform to the technical guidelines about shadowing. And it seemed to suggest that even though planning staff were aware and the applicant's own design submission clearly demonstrated that it didn't meet the city's technical requirements, that it didn't matter. And so I was a little surprised by that. We think it's important to have that space protected. And of course, there's always a bit of room to compromise. But in this case, I think we're seeing the opposite of what the city intends. We're seeing only 2 hours of sunlight a day versus only 2 hours of shadow. And it's pretty dark here in the winter. And I know that space is important for everybody. And so we'd like to see that option explored a little bit further. I think it would have a benefit to everybody.
Okay, as a follow-up, I would ask, from your knowledge, I know that you have been involved in small projects for student housing around the city. From your experience on that end, on the one that provides the construction and works with staff and gets plans approved and so on, you know, in the role that Queens is on this residence project. So you're on the other side in that circumstance. But from your experience, this kind of work to is it your opinion that although the residents, the zoning for the residents is as of right, and that takes care of many aspects of the application, is it your opinion that the shadowing aspect should be part of the assessment of the application and not simply acknowledged on the side as staff have done with you?
Thank you again, Councillor Stroud. I think that ultimately the city put in place these technical guidelines for a reason, and that's because there's a belief and obviously some evidence and a demonstrated need to protect these important areas like amenity space, and in particular the yard of a daycare. And so I know that when we've looked at various development opportunities, that this is something that is the city looks at for us and would consider or would limit in some way what we want to do, that this is a barrier, and it's there for a reason, right? but that's something we run up against. And so it was, I thought it was unusual that it was such an, I would consider it an extreme case. Like I said, it's not like the limit's 2 hours and we're at 2.5 or 3 hours. This is what we're seeing is the exact opposite of what the city has asked. And so in the winter months, the yards will have 2 hours of sunlight a day, 22 hours of darkness. It's hard to believe that that would be something that we would be looking to do in this day and age when we're looking for more outside space and want to preserve mental health and sunshine and all these good things that we're appreciating much more now that we're at home and really getting out and using those spaces. So I think that there's an opportunity there to answer the second part or the other side of the question. If I understood correctly, Councillor Stroud, is that yes, we do put applications like this into the city, and we're usually met with very professional staff that take the time and effort to complete their diligence and look through all the studies we provide and ask very technical questions. And they want to see all those answers before they would ever give us permission to do anything, let alone start work or proceed in what we've seen happening here. And so we'd just like to see all applicants and all residents and parts of the city treated the same. And so whatever that standard is that's being set forth, I think it's important that everybody's treated equally. And I think staff would agree with that.
Thank you. So I'm going to continue with the agenda, which I set down somewhere here. Here we go. We have no briefings. And I will read the business portion for the benefit of those that wish to speak. I do want to point out a couple of things, though. We are very, very strictly limited by the Planning Act. And I'm going to make a couple of statements that I believe are true. And if our staff, if I misspeak, please correct me. The land use and height, density, I believe shadowing, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. All of those are part of the land use planning process, which is under the that gets settled under our zoning and our official plan. And it's my understanding that Queens has been granted and worked, as I understand, closely with planning staff to ensure that those aspects indeed met the existing zoning and the official plan. Is that accurate? Perhaps Ms. Gummo or who else is here? A planner could correct me if I'm wrong.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Agnew will provide a response.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
There you are. Thank you.
So this project has been designed to be fully zoning compliant, and the use is contemplated in the land use designation that exists in the official plan for these particular parcels of land. So from that perspective, those elements of the planning process are already covered off. What we're dealing with now goes to a different section of the Planning Act, which is section 41, and we're dealing with site plan control approval, which is getting into the more detailed elements, which you cannot evaluate and approve or provide a site plan approval if there are zoning compliance issues. So you're correct that the site is fully zoning compliant the way the project has been designed and submitted and what's before you this evening.
Thank you. And I'm just about to get kicked off. There we go. The Planning Act very specifically defines what site plan concerns are. And I'll just read the list, and I believe parking isn't on this list, but should be. But site plan control review are details respecting elements such as access, accessibility, servicing, landscaping, lighting, noise mitigation, stormwater management, wet waste storage, and fire routes. And usually we consider parking as well. These are within the scope of the site plan control review. And that is right from the legislation. I'm going to be fairly strict tonight and politely remind people that we shouldn't be debating or discussing what is outside the city's powers. And talking about density, talking about aspects of height are outside of our purview. And just very quickly, it's my understanding, and again, staff can correct me if I'm wrong, Queens are perfectly within their rights to end this process by taking the city through a very expensive process for both sides to LPAT, because we haven't completed the application within the time frame. And site plan is something that is a delegated authority, and it isn't even within the legislation that we're having this meeting. We're having this meeting, thankfully, because the district councillor followed a policy, not a piece of legislation, that allows us to bump up site plan to give the public an opportunity for input. So we're actually, with this meeting, and this may frustrate some people, we're going beyond the legislated requirements for public consultation. So let's do our best to keep it focused and talking about those site plan issues. So having said that, and I apologize, that took me a lot longer to say than I had anticipated, I will read the business statement. The portion of the meeting, this portion of the meeting is open to the public. The city has initiated a new process in which members of the public will have the opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes on comprehensive reports presented before the planning committee. Those wishing to provide oral comments at this meeting will be invited to do so. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but the person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. We probably should have edited that. This is me speaking again, not the statement. Under the legislation, and again, staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but under the legislation, the public, and I don't agree with this, but this is the legislation, the public does not have the opportunity to appeal a site plan. Only the proponent has an opportunity to appeal. That's the provincial legislation, which is unfortunate, but that's the case. So I will now go on to the regular meeting.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I see that Ms. Morley, our legal counsel, has her hand up. Perhaps we could go to her for a second.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to reiterate a few of the points that you just made there, perfectly summarized. Thank you. I wanted to reiterate that the site plan control provisions of the Planning Act reinforce a notion that this process is intended to be very technical and predictable. There's a specified list of topics in the Planning Act that we can regulate through site plan control, as you've mentioned. if we attempt to incorporate conditions that don't fall within the scope of our authority under the Planning Act, the applicant is entitled to appeal those conditions to the LPAT. So as you've mentioned, elements like interior design, height and density, and manner of construction are not governed through this process. So we wouldn't be permitted to include conditions pertaining to these elements. And touching on the appeal rights, only the applicant has appeal rights on site plan control applications because the application doesn't involve any changes to existing city policies or bylaws. So in this case, the proposed use, height and density of the land comply with both the OP and the applicable zoning bylaw, which speaks more to why only the applicant has appeal rights. That's all.
Thank you very much. We'll agree to disagree on that point, but thank you. That was a good summary. So who's next on the agenda, Mr. Clerk?
The next presenter will be Ms. Grant, who has a PowerPoint presentation, and then the applicant is making a PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, can you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Hear it loud and clear.
Perfect. So I have a bit of a presentation. I'm sorry if it's a bit long or touches on things that we've already covered, but I just wanted to make sure that it was thorough because it's a bit of a different process for the committee. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So it's nice to see everyone, albeit virtually today. So I'm here to present staff's recommendation related to the site plan control application for the property municipally addressed as 120 and 130 Albert Street and 142 to 154 Albert Street. So if you can just change the next slide, James. So since this is not a typical application type we see at Planning Committee, I wanted to provide an overview of the purpose and the scope of site plan control under the Planning Act. Site plan control is a tool offered by Section 41 of the Act and allows cities the opportunity to review and have some technical control over the function and design of development proposals that comply with the existing zoning and are permitted as of right, as we say, before building permits are issued. Through site plan control review, the city strives to ensure that a development is safe, functional, and attractive. The review also endeavors to ensure that adverse impacts on neighboring properties are minimized, understanding, of course, the scope of the abilities that are provided to us under Section 41 of the Act. This means that, for example, while things like shadowing and overlook are compatibility aspects to be considered, where zoning already gives a property owner specific permissions for maximum height and minimum yards, these permissions cannot be further restricted by the city through the site plan control process under the Act. The city's many technical agencies, including our engineering, forestry, servicing, and transportation departments, as some examples, also review site plan control applications from a technical perspective in order to ensure that any applicable city standards and bylaws are complied with, as well as to recommend any required conditions to be included in the agreement. Upon approval of a site plan control application, a legal agreement is entered into between the city and the property owner in order to ensure that the development complies with what was reviewed and approved through the site plan control process. Site plan control agreements typically include a number of conditions which the property owner must then comply with. The city holds financial securities from the property owner to ensure that the works are completed as agreed upon, and these securities are released only after the works are completed to the satisfaction of the city. Site plan control applications differ from typical applications reviewed by the Planning Committee, like we talked about, such as official plan amendments or zoning bylaw amendments, as site plan control applications are not proposing any changes to existing bylaws. Through site plan control, a property owner is effectively implementing the existing legal rights that apply to their property. As we talked about, this means that the Planning Act only includes appeal mechanisms for site plan control approvals to the owner of the property. And the general idea behind this is that the official plan and zoning policies have already gone through a public process and had an associated appeal period when they were originally adopted by council. So James, if you can go to the next slide. So in the city of Kingston, site plan control approval or applications are typically approved by the Director of Planning Services, as this power has been delegated by council through their delegation of authority bylaw. All site plan control applications are circulated to council members when we receive them, and the bylaw does offer council the ability to bump up applications for review at Planning Committee. The intent is to provide an enhanced forum to receive public comment on matters that are relevant to site plan control. This bump up meeting is not a statutory public meeting required by the Planning Act, but is a courtesy that is provided by council. Next slide, please, James. As is typical practice for this type of request, staff are recommending tonight that Planning Committee approve the subject application in principle and direct any outstanding technical matters back to the Director of Planning Services for final approval. At this point, the city has completed 3 rounds of technical commentary on the subject application and is currently working with the applicant to address a small number of outstanding matters related to servicing. All matters will need to be adequately addressed to the satisfaction of our technical agencies prior to the issuance of final site plan control approval by the director. As well, any comments that are received by the committee and by members of the public tonight will be recorded and reviewed by staff to ensure that all site plan control matters are adequately addressed ahead of final approval. Of note, an additional condition has been included in staff's recommendation before the committee tonight related to the laneway, as has been advised by the city's legal counsel. So before the previously scheduled May 28th meeting, Planning Committee was advised that a law firm had been retained to undertake an independent review of the status of Queen's title to the laneway. This review has not yet been completed to date. These type of title matters are governed at the provincial level, and the city plays no role in adjudicating these kind of disputes. The purpose of the additional condition is to allow any title related dispute to be advanced in the appropriate forum prior to final site plan approval being granted. Next slide, please, James. So before I go into detail about this site and the application, I wanted to just provide the committee with some background related to the heritage context and process of this file. The property is not currently subject to any requirements under the Ontario Heritage Act. However, city staff and Queen's representatives recognize the cultural heritage value of the existing dwellings on the property. As such, city heritage staff began working with Queen's to review initial plans for this site in late 2018, early 2019, prior to any formal submission being made. At that time, staff worked to provide a framework for heritage conservation of the significant physical elements of the buildings, as well as the Albert streetscape more broadly. This work was based on previous cultural heritage evaluations of the site and was further informed by a number of staff site visits. At the onset of these discussions, staff prepared a sketch which outlined the elevations of the buildings that contained cultural heritage attributes and should be considered for conservation. At that time, elevations at 142, 144, 148, and 152 Albert Street were included. 154 Albert Street was not identified as an important built heritage resource. Staff acknowledged at that time that many complex constraints and considerations would inform the feasibility of this preliminary approach, and also recognize that the residence building is positioned to meet a number of other city planning policy objectives, including the provision of housing for the city student population to relieve pressure on the rental housing market and surrounding residential neighborhoods. Staff worked with Queen's through this balance of heritage considerations with other planning considerations through ongoing conversation and refinement of the concept. Through these conversations, Queen's ultimately has agreed to the retention of 142 and 144 Albert Street, which were noted to be in generally good condition and were recognized to have a high level of physical and design integrity. Queen's then worked with their consulting architects to develop a proposal that would conserve these dwellings and incorporate them as functional elements of the student residence. The design also considers the existing setbacks along Albert Street to provide consistency with the retained buildings and to preserve the mature street trees which contribute to the cultural heritage value of the street. Staff are now working with Queen's to include both 142 and 144 Albert Street in the updated heritage easement agreement between Queen's and the city. The inclusion of the Albert Street property in the easement agreement aligns with the approach the city has taken for many years in the conservation of resources on Queen's campus. Next slide, please, James. So for context, the subject property includes the buildings addressed as 120 and 130 Albert Street and 142 to 154 Albert Street. A university-owned laneway which runs east to west from Albert Street to the rear of the property and north to south along the rear of some of the property forms part of the connection between the northern and southern portions of the site. While the property does currently contain 7 municipal addresses, it is now legally one parcel of land, and as such, the entire property will be subject to the same site plan control agreement. Council approved a bylaw to exempt the subject lands from part lot control at their meeting on January 21st, 2020. This bylaw allowed for the consolidation of the properties and part of the private lane to facilitate the development of the new student residence, and also facilitates easier access to right-of-ways for neighboring property owners. The property is located on the northwestern side of the Queen's University main campus, across the street from the Tyndall parking lot. Queen's Daycare is located immediately to the north of the site on Albert Street, with Victoria Hall across the street to the south. To the northwest and south of the property are existing residential properties, which are low density in form. Next slide, please. The property is designated institutional in the City of Kingston official plan. Post-secondary uses are permitted within this designation, and the plan specifies that student accommodations are included as a permitted complementary use. The applicable zoning bylaw is intended to establish site-appropriate provisions for institutional uses within the designation. The subject property is located entirely within the E Special Education and Medical Zone of zoning bylaw number 8499. The E zone permits university uses and applies to a majority of the Queen's main campus. This zoning has been in place in this location since at least the 1970s. Through a review of the proposed development, staff have determined that the development complies with all applicable provisions of the zoning bylaw, and a zoning compliance table has been included in staff's report. The existing planning policy framework, which applies to this property, therefore anticipates and aims to facilitate the proposed form of institutional development we see before us here tonight. Next slide, please, James. So the site plan control application proposes a 5-story, 338-bed student residence on the portion of the property municipally addressed as 142 to 154 Albert Street. The 2 existing buildings at 142 and 144 Albert Street will be maintained and incorporated into the building design. The proposed building materials are similar to those seen throughout the Queen's campus, including limestone masonry and glass paneling. And in this way, the proposed building is context sensitive and is complementary to the surrounding institutional campus. For clarity, no changes to the buildings or site layout at 120 or 130 Albert Street are proposed as part of the application. Those buildings currently contain 3 habitation units each. The site plan drawings registered against the property will include these 2 buildings and the existing site landscaping and layout to ensure that any future change to this portion of the property will be subject to further site plan control review and approval. Next slide, please, James. So in terms of the site layout, Queens will go into a little bit more detail in their presentation, but I'll just provide an overview from the city's perspective. So the building has been specifically designed by the applicants from the onset to comply with the existing zoning permissions of the E zone applicable to the property. The E zone does not include a maximum permissible height provision, but rather regulates height and building footprint by requiring side yards which are proportionate to a building's height. The provided side yards at 9.3 meters to the north and 9 meters to the south exceed the minimum required by the zone. A 7.5 meter required rear yard is also provided, which accommodates a portion of the laneway. Finally, while the E zone does not include a minimum front yard requirement, a 6.8 meter front yard is provided, which aims to respect the setbacks of the retained buildings at 142 and 144 Albert Street and to follow the curve of Albert Street. The setback from the front lot line also allows most of the existing mature trees in the front yard to be maintained. Trees will be removed from the rear of the site to accommodate the layout. However, 27 new deciduous and 13 new small tree plantings are proposed on the site to offset the loss in accordance with the replanting ratios outlined in the city's tree bylaw. A courtyard is proposed to direct an exterior student amenity space away from the rear yards of adjacent properties and to facilitate an effective interior room layout. Loading and waste collection will be provided via an oversized space at the southwest corner of the building, accessed by the right-of-way. Queens has indicated that loading activities will be minimal on the site, given that there are no food services provided within the building. In accordance with the E-zone, no vehicular parking is proposed on the site. The E-zone also does not have bicycle parking requirements. However, Queens is providing approximately 100 indoor bicycle parking spaces in the basement, and additional outdoor bicycle racks are being provided near the front entrance. So like I said, this is a summary of the site layout, but Queens will elaborate on this in their presentation, which will follow mine. And we're happy to answer any questions related to the layout following these presentations. James, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the application so far has been subject to 3 rounds of technical commentary by the city's commenting agencies. Staff are enough comfortable that all technical matters have been or are nearly adequately addressed, and as such are recommending approval in principle of the site plan application. Any matters that are being finalized at this point will need to be finalized to the satisfaction of staff before final approval is issued. Of note, as part of the technical review, engineering staff have identified that 6 pedestrian light fixtures have been proposed behind the municipal sidewalk within the Albert Street road allowance, as is typical in the Queens campus area. Approval for this type of encroachment is required by council, as staff do not have delegated authority. Staff have reviewed the proposed pedestrian light fixture encroachments and recommend that they be approved. This portion of the recommendation would be carried forward to council for approval if it's successful tonight. And next slide, please, James. So in summary, this application for site plan control approval complies with applicable zoning, and staff are satisfied that the proposal will comply with all technical standards and requirements. Staff recommend approval of the application in principle without any outstanding matters being directed back to the Director of Planning Services. Given this is a proposal by Queens to meet the university's needs, Queens and its agents are also going to provide additional background on the proposal, including their rationale for selecting this location as a resident site, as I know there's been public questions about that. The details, design considerations made by the team in development of the proposal, and an overview of Queens's process so far. After this presentation, we'll be available to answer any questions from committee and members of the public. Thanks.
Thank you. I will go to the committee now if there are questions of the presenter. Yes, Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'm wondering if the planner can speak to the designs that were shown, particularly the mock-ups of what it would look like from the street. My question is, how accurate are those, and is it subject to change going forward? The reason for my questioning is that we've seen other site plans in the past where when we asked the same thing, we were told, well, it might not actually look like that in the end, which is obviously disheartening. And I think that's particularly important given the context of the residential neighborhoods around, and having people that may be neighbors to this property know what they're actually dealing with should it go forward. So what we've seen tonight, is that what it will actually look like?
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I'm happy to answer this question, but just for the chair, Queens does have a presentation which will go into a little bit more detail, including the architect will be speaking to the design. So it might be beneficial for the committee to hear that before questions are directed to staff.
Yeah, fair. That's fine. Thank you. We can do it then.
Sure, but I'm happy to speak to your question now just so that we don't forget it moving on. So tied to the site plan control agreement, there will be elevations, which essentially tie the applicant to the design. Through site plan control, we're a bit limited in terms of like very physical materials of what we can control, but we can control the general design and layout in terms of like colors and general materials and that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And one more question, Mr. Chair, through you,
Sure thing.
is concerning the heritage aspects of the site. Was there discussion to keep more of the buildings? We know that 142 and 144 Albert are being kept, but I look at other places on Queen's campus, like on Berry Street, where the med school is, and see that the whole streetscape was kept with the building behind it. Could you talk about why only 2 of those buildings on Albert are being kept?
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So heritage planning staff had been working with Queens, as I said, about 2 years ago through this process. At that point, heritage staff did recommend that there were elevations on additional buildings that had cultural heritage value and would be beneficial to keep. Based on kind of the numbers, as I understand it, that Queens is looking for in order to accommodate their student growth, keeping those buildings wouldn't allow for the room count that they would needed without them going much higher on the site. So I think there were conversations between planning staff and heritage staff in terms of what the impacts would be from a higher building internal to the block versus retaining 2 of those buildings and having a 5-story building on the site. So the architect may be able to speak to this a little bit more specifically, but that's my understanding from staff's perspective of how those heritage conversations went.
Okay, that is a start. Thank you. And I would love to hear the same response or a more nuanced response from the architect. So I'll ask the question then too. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
So, Councillor Neal, I believe it was intended that we'd hear from the Queen's presentation before getting into committee. I'll leave that.
I appreciate that, but I think, I mean, clearly, I'm gonna overrule that, and we're going to hear the committee because those were 2 distinct presentations, and I didn't want people to confuse the fact that the city and Queens had the same answers to all of the questions. So, and I have recognized Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe this is okay to ask. In the previous presentation, it was indicated by the respondent that there was problems with the shadowing. So one of the claims was that the shadowing criteria, that they were told by staff the shadowing criteria does not have to be met. And I was wondering if staff could respond to that. Is it accurate? And if not, why not?
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Am I supposed to raise my hand every time I answer, James? Sorry, I don't know if I've missed that part of it.
You're okay right now, Janice.
Okay, perfect. So Mr. McKinnon was speaking to a terms of reference that staff prepared internally to provide to applicants who were seeking additional permissions for height within the city. So oftentimes kind of at the, I think, depending on the application, if there is additional height proposed, staff may request a shadow study be completed to determine what impacts from that additional height would be on neighboring properties. In this case, as the applicant is implementing the existing zoning and no additional height is being proposed, a shadow study was not identified as required for this application, as the proposed height and the location of the building is already confirmed to be permitted by the city through the existing zoning. So Queens voluntarily submitted this shadow study in response to comments that were received by neighbors related to shadowing, just to kind of provide a picture of what the shadowing would be. The shadow impact, I think that Queens will go a little bit more detailed into this as part of their review. But the impacts to neighboring properties during the spring, summer, and fall are minimal. So where we're speaking about kind of rear yards being shadowing more throughout the year is in the winter. The terms of reference, the 2-hour guideline is for the spring and the fall dates. So it doesn't apply to the winter just because of where we are in the world. It's hard to not have shadowing in the winter, but just kind of to bring it back high level, the terms of reference is what we provide to applicants who are seeking additional height and doesn't apply in this case where the applicants are implementing existing height permissions.
Okay, so fundamentally it follows from the zoning to some fundamental sense, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and part of the claim also was, the question is, maybe you're not in a position to answer this. Can the, this follows from the shadowing aspect, can the building be sited such as to reduce the current shadowing effect?
So thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So as I noted, the proposal has been, or the building has been designed to be zone compliant. So we cannot necessarily require the building to shift one way or another. The siting of the building right now was done based on conversations with heritage staff about the existing street wall on Albert Street. And there are a number of mature trees along this portion of the street that the applicant is intending to maintain. So shifting of the building would influence the streetscape of Albert Street and push the new building ahead of the heritage buildings, which are being retained. So that's one consideration there. I mean, if the applicant wanted to change their design, that is kind of their prerogative, but the city can't require that at this point because it is zone compliant in terms of its siting.
Right, so what I got from that was not only zone compliant, but a balance of planning considerations, heritage, tree canopy, and the like.
Yes, exactly.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Seeing no further questions at this time for staff, we'll go on to the next delegation or the next presenters. Thank you.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Good evening. My name is Jennifer Wood, and I'm a land use planner for planning and design. First off, thank you staff for the introduction to this project and also to the clerks for organizing this meeting and all that goes along with the logistics of that. We really appreciate it. I'm joined tonight virtually by some of the project team members who I'll just briefly introduce. Don Schmidt is an architect with Diamond Schmidt Architects. His firm has decades of experience working on institutional projects across North America. I'm also joined by Julian Smith, who is an architect and heritage specialist who's been involved in this project and its design from the very beginning. Finally, I'm also joined by Tony Goetz and Craig LaRue, who are both with Queen's University. And we're here tonight, of course, to present a site plan control application for this proposed new student residence project on Albert Street. Now, I would just say as a group, we will be providing responses to any questions or comments. So please do bear with us as we do coordinate these responses. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just start with some background on the need for a new residence and why this particular site was selected. A new residence is required for a couple of reasons. First, modest enrollment growth is expected over the coming years. As well, there are planned renovations to some of the existing aging residence buildings, which will temporarily displace students. Now, just as municipalities have official plans in place to set goals and objectives for how they want to see their city grow, Queens has a campus master plan. And this master plan is essentially a framework for change that's intended to guide how Queens physically evolves over the coming years. The campus master plan was completed in 2014 after a 15-month study period, which included a comprehensive public consultation program. And so the Albert Street site pretty quickly emerged as a preferred location based on the direction given in the campus master plan. The top image in this slide is the main campus precinct plan, and the proposed residence site is identified as development parcel 2A, which is on the left-hand side. The master plan does contemplate the development of a structure over this entire site, over all 5 of the existing buildings, with a new central courtyard. One of the other plans that we looked at from the master plan was the campus housing plan, which is the bottom image, and the purple dashed line identifies different areas on and near the campuses that are considered appropriate for university housing. The west side of Albert Street, right up to Union, is included in this area, essentially expanding on the existing residence cluster. The master plan even goes so far as to identify permitted uses in the different development parcels, and development parcel 2A permits a student residence whereas development parcel 2B, for example, which is the parking lot to the east, does not permit a residence use. All that to say that through a master planning process, the site has been identified for redevelopment and a residence is permitted in this location. Next slide, please. This image is also taken from the campus master plan, and it shows essentially the location of the site on the western edge of main campus. This site, it really benefits from its close proximity to existing university uses, including both academic as well as food services. Next slide, please. This slide includes an aerial image of the area, and the red outline shows the property limits. The site is 0.78 hectares in size, and this area does include the right-of-way on the property, which provides access to several properties on Union and Collingwood Street. The site is currently occupied by 7 buildings, all originally constructed as residential dwellings, but over the years have evolved and been used for both residential and university uses. In terms of the immediately surrounding context, to the north is Queen's Daycare, a number of parking areas off of the laneway, and residential uses on Union Street. To the east is Albert Street, as well as a large parking lot. To the south are residential uses, and to the west are, for the most part, parking areas and also residential uses on Collingwood Street. As noted in Mr. McKinnon's presentation, Queens did purchase 138 Albert Street. I think it closed just last month. This is the first property to the south of the site, and it is not currently part of subject lands. 138 Albert was not owned at the time the residence was designed, nor when the site plan application was submitted. So we're not contemplating, shifting the building at this time, as it would result in the building no longer complying with zoning. Next slide, please. As part of our preliminary review, we of course looked at the applicable official plan and zoning bylaw requirements for the site. This slide includes an image from Kingston K-Maps that illustrates the applicable OP designation and zoning. So the property is currently zoned institutional, that's the pink area, and is zoned special education and medical uses E zone, which is essentially the zoning that applies to the broader Queens main campus. And both the official plan and zoning bylaw, as staff mentioned, permit a student residence in this location. Next slide, please. So once we establish that the campus master plan contemplates a student residence here and confirm that the use is permitted, we began the design process. This slide provides an overview of the development proposal, including a site plan and a summary of some of the key statistics. So the building is proposed to be 5 stories in height. 2 of the existing buildings located at 142 and 144 Albert Street are proposed to be retained and physically integrated into the new construction in order to help provide a transition between the institutional uses of the university to the east towards that residential character to the west. The building contains 338 habitation units. That's basically the zoning bylaws term for student residence accommodations. It's a term that reflects number of beds, regardless of whether the rooms are private or shared. The building has a relatively square footprint with a central courtyard, which really helps to maximize opportunities for natural light in interior spaces and provides an enclosed amenity space for the students. The principal entrance is located off of Albert Street in the northeast corner. A loading space and garbage area are included at the back of the building in the southwest corner and are proposed to be accessed by the right-of-way. There's no on-site food service proposed in this residence, so loading activities will primarily be limited to garbage and recycling pickup, so it'll be quite limited. The zoning bylaw doesn't require bicycle parking for residence buildings. However, and we'll speak to this later, Queensy is seeking to design a LEED Gold building, so providing sufficient bicycle parking is certainly a main priority. There will be a room that can accommodate 100 bikes, as well as some at-grade bike parking at the front entrance. Next slide, please. Throughout the design process, we've engaged various members of the Queens and Kingston community to seek feedback on the design. Almost a year ago now, in June 2019, we held our first open house at Mitchell Hall, where the preliminary concept plan and massing model were presented. Attendees had a chance to review boards. We had a physical model that was created from a 3D printer, had a chance to speak with members of the project team, ask questions, get information, provide feedback. In September, the project team met with representatives of the Sydney District Association to discuss the project. There was a second open house on November 6th, and at this time, a project website was launched where more information was made available and contact details for members of the project team. The team also engaged several Queens groups, including the Built Environment Advisory Group and Office of Indigenous Initiatives. And there have been, over the last year, and will continue to be, ongoing discussions directly with private property owners in the area. So, throughout the last year, we've done a lot of work to prepare and refine this plan. It's evolved architecturally based on feedback we've received through our own consultation efforts and based on the technical review process with staff. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Don Schmidt, who's the architect for this project, who's going to walk you through some of the more detailed sort of the design and architectural considerations of the project. So James, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide and turning Mr. Schmidt on.
Right.
Sure, Mr. Schmidt's like.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Just very briefly to give some context, we've, with our partners Schultz and Zabak, have been the architects for 4 residence buildings at Queens, including Leggett Hall and Watts Hall, just to the south of this site. And we've also are the architects for the medical school and the houses that were referenced earlier by Councillor Hutchison on Berry Street. Just want to make a kind of few quick points. First of all, and I think you've heard extensively this evening, that the proposal and the design meets all requirements of the official plan in terms of land use. It meets all the elements of the zoning bylaw in terms of built form, in terms of setbacks from the property line, in terms of building height. I think that's quite important and has been made by others very well. As you can see in these renderings, there are 2 existing houses of the 5 in this portion of the block that have been retained and incorporated into the design. That is a process that was really emerged from working closely with the university and Julian Smith, who is an advisor on historic properties to the university's master plan, and we consulted with him in this particular case. And the conclusion of that was to retain these 2 existing houses and incorporate them within the building. The building, as has been mentioned, is 5 stories high, a little over 50 feet in height at its maximum zoning height. It is built around a quadrangle, and it is really designed to both recognize its position on the edge of campus, fronting the campus to the east, and the campus compounds to the south of this particular block, but also, of course, the residential scale of buildings to the west and to the north. The question came up, are these renderings that you see on the screen accurate? And the short answer is yes, they are as accurate as we can make them, given computer generated renders, which capture the materials of the building, which are limestone in context of the Queen's vernacular, incorporates a significant amount of light brick masonry that is also very much sympathetic to the Queen's architectural vocabulary, and vertical fins and detailing, as well as a kind of window proportion that are both recognize the residential context and the university context. Two other points I would make, and it was made earlier, we have retained all the mature trees along Albert Street and other trees. There are some trees being removed on the west side of the property, but there is a net increase of 22 trees shown in the landscape plan, and it is designed to a high standard of sustainability LEED Gold. Next slide, please. I think the key issues here are really that we've recognized the surrounding context in terms of height, but also in terms of the laneway. There is an easement across the Queen's property on the north side that provides access not only to for Queen's, but adjacent other property owners to the north and to the west. That access across that easement is being retained and maintained, but the easement is being improved, it's being paved, it's being widened. It's 5.05 meters in width on the north frontage parallel to the property line, and it's 6.1 meters wide on the west property line, and no portion of the landscaping or the curb or any aspect of the building project encroaches on that easement. So that is free and clear to access parking that has been part of some adjacent lots. And the building is designed to kind of really transition to its neighborhood context. The next slide, please, speaks to the issues of shadows. And I want to just reiterate that the built form and the height of the building, and height, of course, determines shadows, is entirely within what's provided for within the zoning bylaw. Nevertheless, we were understood that shadows were a concern, and so while it's not required by the city, we undertook to do complete shadow studies. And what's pictured here is the fall and spring equinox, so March 21 and September 21. And as per the city guidelines, across the top from left to right, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., the center row, noon, 1 and 2, the lower row, 3, 4, and 5 p.m. So covering the kind of key hours of the day. And you can see that in this condition that the property backyards on to the west and to the are only in shadow 2 hours out of all the daylight hours over the course of the day. So that is completely kind of meets a reasonable standard. And you can see for all the lots on the north side, all of those lots are in partial or complete sunlight for the whole day. I think that's a key issue. Next slide looks at the summer solstice, which is June 21, coming up in a couple of days. And you can see, because the sun is higher, the shadows are shorter. And you can see that except for about 1.5, let's call it 2 hours out of the 15 daylight hours in these longest days of the year, all the kind of adjacent backyards and property are fully in daylight for the entire course of the day. And that includes the quadrangle in the middle of our block, the frontages along Albert Street, the properties to the south, etc. The next slide is the winter solstice. So this is the so-called dead of winter. And I think the earlier presentation on shadows was really talking about this time, December 21st. Of course, the sun is very low in the sky. The days are very short. Because the sun is low, the shadow cast shadow casts are long. And what's characteristic of all of these is that the existing shadow without the residence is in gray, and the additional shadow of the residence is in brown. So you can see that in any of the hours of the day, the shadows are, because it is the middle of winter, very long shadows, and those are both created by surrounding buildings, but also the kind of residence itself. So that's a kind of summary, and I think the only reference that was being made to 2 hours of sunlight a day would be, is this December 20, that was previously made, is about this December time frame. And you can see that actually, depending on where you are in the plan, for example, from the kind of middle of the day through the afternoon, there is light in adjacent yards to the west and to the north. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. And next slide, please. So just building on what Don talked about, I think landscaping is also a really critical part of the overall design. And this is a conceptual landscape plan illustrating plantings and hardscaping. As Don mentioned, there will be a net increase of 22 trees post-development. We've lined both the north and west sides of the building where it abuts the right-of-way with a variety of trees, primarily oaks, maples, and hornbeams. So this will help to soften the appearance of those facades and will also help to provide a little bit of a visual screen for views out of the residence rooms towards some of the adjacent parking areas. The south side of the building also includes trees and shrubs, mostly to help screen the garbage in the loading area. The central courtyard includes both hard and softscaping elements, patios, lawn areas, deciduous trees, shrubs, and ornamental grasses. And finally, it's really important to note that there are currently a number of street trees along Albert Street, several of which are quite mature. And it was an early priority for the design team to maintain as many of those street trees as possible. And the end result is that the majority are to be retained, including 3 silver maples, a white spruce, 2 elms, London plane tree, and an oak as well. So I think of the 14, I believe 10 or 11 are being retained. Next slide, please. Now, site plan control doesn't regulate interior spaces, but we did want to share the first floor plan just to give a sense of the layout. The main entrance, like I said, is at the northeast corner of the building, which based on the way this plan is oriented is the bottom right with the quite wide accessible path leading to Albert Street. And this entrance essentially leads to a reception and a large lounge area. The 2 retained buildings will primarily serve as indoor amenity space for students, So the first and second floors will be repurposed for meeting rooms, yoga rooms, lounges, study rooms, these kinds of spaces. And then the third floor of these buildings will be converted to living quarters for the student life coordinators. And then of course, the remainder of the building is primarily residence rooms with smaller lounges throughout each of the upper floors. Next slide, please. I do think that staff and also the chair have provided a really great overview of what site plan control is and what it looks like. I just wanted to reiterate that it is a process that examines design and technical aspects of a proposed development that already complies with zoning. And I think I'm probably not going to speak too much more to this slide because I think it's been already really well articulated in terms of what site plan looks at. So I guess I would just emphasize that, you know, in this case, as stated before, this is a built form and use that's permitted as of right, and that we're really undertaking a technical exercise to demonstrate that this functions well. And I think through the preparation and review of all of the submission requirements that you can see listed on that right-hand side, that, you know, we're confident that the development will be appropriate and will function well. Next slide, please. And just to summarize, it's my opinion that this development proposal is consistent with the direction of the Queen's Campus Master Plan. It's a permitted use in the institutional designation of the OP. It meets all of the applicable requirements of the zoning bylaw. It's compatible with surrounding uses, as Don discussed, based on a number of factors. It's massing, its materiality, the way it's been cited, shadow impacts are quite minimal. And finally, the plan retains and integrates two existing buildings as part of the transition from institutional to residential. That does conclude my presentation, and our team would be happy to respond to any questions or comments from members of the committee and of course members of the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I will go to the committee now if there are any questions for any of the Queen's presentation. Now would be the time for the committee to ask. I see Councillor Kiley and I see Councillor Osanek leaning towards raising their hands. So we're good. Councillor Kiley, followed by Councillor Osanek.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to follow up on the two questions I had about the placement of the two houses that are retained. I think that they've been well said in this past presentation, so I'm actually going to leave that one. So thanks for clarifying their use and how they were decided to be kept, balancing the east and the west of the campus use. That was interesting to know. But I do want to talk a bit more about the renderings that we've seen. I appreciate that they are the best we can do with CGI and the materials that are intended to be used. But my follow-up would be, if there are changes going forward, how will the community be made aware of that?
Perhaps I can, it's Don Schmidt, perhaps I can address that. I would say the materials, the color and the detail are really fully described on the documents that have been submitted to the city as part of the site plan application. The choices of the limestone, the brick, all of that has been resolved and is accurately represented in the rendering. So it's very unlikely we will be making changes. The documentation is quite complete, but if there is for any reason any changes contemplated, which I totally do not expect at this point, we would be pleased to notify all the kind of parties. But it's important to note that all the materials are documented in the materials submitted to the city, and that will be part of the registered agreement, site plan agreement with the city of Kingston.
Very good. Thank you.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Councillor Kiley. I believe Ms. Wood also has some comments to provide.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, just to build on that, and I think Don really kind of touched on it right at the end there. The renderings that we've presented are just that. Their renderings aren't required through site plan control. What is required are the official building elevations, which are the architectural documents that ultimately become construction drawings that inform the actual building design. Those building elevations are attached to the site plan agreement that gets registered on title. So if moving forward, whether it's during construction or changes after the fact, any changes that deviate from the elevations that are attached to that site plan agreement will trigger a site plan modification, which opens up this whole process again and could, be bumped up just as we are here tonight.
Thank you for the further clarity. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Councillor Sanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question through you to the Queen staff and planners is about the trees, because I believe we are allowed to talk about trees under site plan. So we've seen one tree already removed and it's going to be compensated for. We're within the tree migratory, or what is it, the bird nesting migratory act right now through to the end of July. And we saw an email today from our city staff saying that a further 19 trees look to be applied for to be removed immediately. So a nesting survey is going to be done when that occurs. What is Queen's plan if there are nests determined in those 19 trees? What's Queen's plan to then deal with the birds at that time?
So we have hands up from Miss Grant and Miss Wood. Perhaps we'll go to Miss Wood first from Queens, and then Miss Grant.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, and I believe to the permitting process related to tree removal and some of the checks and balances that happen through that process. But I can say that, as you noted, Queens has engaged a qualified ecologist to review the trees and see if they observe any nesting. And I think our answer is that we would be looking to that professional to advise us moving forward on any requirements that have to be met prior to any tree removal.
And I believe Ms. Grant has some additional information.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just provide a little bit of background about the tree permit. So usually when we process a site plan control application, the tree bylaw exempts a property owner from requiring a tree permit where that tree removal has already been reviewed by forestry staff, and any compensation or protection or securities or any of those things are done through that process. That usually exempts site plan control from tree permitting. In this case, as the applicants had applied for demolition permits for the properties or the buildings that were not being retained, forestry, through their review of those permits, flagged that a tree permit should be required before site plan approval, so that forestry could make sure that the appropriate tree protections were put in place, and the city took securities for any trees, especially the municipally owned trees, so that if anything were to happen by chance during demolition, we would have securities for that. So a tree permit is being obtained in advance of site plan control approval in this case. The tree, just to clarify what's proposed to be removed at this point and what's being approved through the tree permit, the agreement that will be tied to that permit will permit the removal of trees number 14, 15, 18, and 19 showed on the tree inventory, which are 3 Norway maple and 1 black locust that are all in moderate to poor condition, if I'm reading that right from the tree inventory. So the condition of that tree permit would be that the remaining trees can only be removed after the site plan control agreement is approved. So effectively what this is doing is allowing Queens to remove 4 trees before the final site plan control agreement is registered. But it does tie Queens to needing to have that document registered before they can proceed with the additional removals. And related to the migratory birds, condition has been included in the tree permit that applies to all of the trees on the site, but specifically for right now, what will be removed in the coming weeks will be that, as Jen noted, an ecologist or biologist will need to do a review confirming there is no active nesting sites within the trees identified for removal. And essentially what the notice of decision has, I have it up in front of me here. Sorry, just one second there. So if a nesting site is located, the tree shall not be removed until, in the opinion of the ecologist or biologist, the nesting site has become inactive. So if any trees were determined to have active nesting sites, it would be up for the ecologist or biologist to eventually give the go-ahead when that has been cleared.
Okay, thank you very much for that additional clarification and information. That was very helpful. And I do thank Queens for retaining 10 of the trees and also for doing a net increase overall of 22 trees when this is built out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, I want to thank you. We'll now go on to, let me just find my agenda again. We'll go on to the planning committee. There is a recommendation that's before us. Quick question of the clerk, if I can.
Sure.
We should do the public consultation portion before we move and second the recommendation. Is that accurate?
Correct, Mr. Chair. If I may, I might just go over the raised hand function quickly, and then we'll turn to members of the public.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right. So just to refresh everyone's memory in the public gallery, in the lower menu, there's a button that says participants. If you click on that button, that should launch a list on the right portion of your screen. Within that area, there should be a button in the bottom right-hand corner that says raise hand. If you wish to speak, I would ask that you utilize that button to gain our attention, and we will get to you in a few moments. Additionally, to the member of the public that has called in, if you would wish to participate, please hit *9. Again, that is star and then the number 9 if you wish to speak. If anyone wishes to speak, I would ask that you use the raise hand function at this time, and I'll return to the chair.
Thank you very much. And everybody has an opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes. The clerk will flag to me or give me notice that I should give you a 30-second remaining heads up. And we typically, during the public portion, we gather all of the questions. And at the end of that, we go to staff or the proponent to answer those questions. Okay, so it's a little bit different than when the committee is asking questions. So I guess we're ready to go, Mr. Clerk.
I'm currently not seeing any hands, but I believe that 2 members of the public have submitted slides. So if they would like to raise their hand, we will start with one of them. And we do have a speaker now, so I'll get them to provide their name and address once they're live here in a second.
Thank you. And I should have mentioned you need to identify both your name and your address before you begin your questions. Thank you.
Hi, it's Don Gerson at 134. Let's try to get the audio. 134 Albert, can you hear me okay?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. And I have two brief questions. I hope they're under the scope of the meeting, but I'm not completely sure because I don't know the rules as well as you people do. But the first one's under the concept of access. And I did not see on the website a detailed mobility study. It talks about some parking, it talks about some bicycle racks. It says the university provides parking and general services of that nature, but it doesn't address the question of daily traffic. And there will be, in excess of 300 students living in this building. There's not a cafeteria in the building. They will be walking from this building to one of the other residences down the road. So 3 times a day, we're going to have 300 people walking along the road. And I think it's important to look at this peak load situation and make sure that it doesn't interfere. What happens if there's a fire drill at the same time? What happens if there's a fire at the same time? What happens if there's an emergency vehicle needed for, health or other reasons? And does the sidewalk have the right carrying capacity? It's a 10-minute walk. Will it be a 10-minute walk when it's covered in snow? So I think it's important to look at the mobility questions that are raised by the location of this building, and especially the absence of a cafeteria in this building requiring the students to walk such a long way down the road in the middle of winter. And there's also, of course, safety and everything else with respect to traffic on Albert Street. So that's one question. And then very briefly, the other one is, which may not be under the scope of the committee, but I think I'll ask it just so it's recorded. This is the limestone city. We're all sitting on a large block of limestone. It's under your house and mine. It's under the Queen's buildings, and it's under the new building, and it's certainly under our building here at 134 Albert Street. In construction of the new building, there will be excavation into this limestone, no doubt. And I was wondering if there's a requirement from the city or anyone else to have seismic monitoring, not only at the site of excavation, but also in the houses that will be affected by that. Certainly at this location, I'm guessing 300 meters away from the Smith Business School, during the excavation there, we felt those shocks at this house, and it caused cracks and settling in some of our walls. And there's a large number of houses within a 300 or 500 meter radius where the shocks will be transmitted through the underground limestone. So I think this exceeds the radius covered by the university's education zoning district and goes into other areas that will be affected by any activity that causes shock waves in the limestone underlying the city. So I request that somebody should look into this, and that maybe someone should consider that the university should have an insurance policy to deal with damage caused by their activities during this construction process. So those are my two comments.
Thank you very much, Don. And I'm sure our staff or Queens can address both of those questions. Do we have somebody else in the
Yes,
wings?
we do, Mr. Chair. Speaker is Susan Gao, and I'm aware that she has provided 3 pictures to Derek. So I will just ask that the member of the public articulate to Derek when she would like the pictures presented.
Thank you.
Not yet, but this is going to follow up on the person who just spoke beforehand, because I'm going to talk about the water issues as well. I live at 99 Collingwood Street, so I'm a little bit further down on the block. My father-in-law was the first one to come here. He was the late Donald J.S. Gow, and he was the founder of the School of Public Administration, or now the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. And he purchased this property in the late 1960s. And as far as I know, there were no water issues in our house at that time. And since the constructions of many of the Queen's buildings, the library in 93, the business in 2011, and the parking lot on Albert Street in 2012, the amount of water that has been in our basement has significantly decreased, especially after all the blasting from the parking lot on Albert Street. My family moved in to this house in 1986, and we had no spring water or any seepage in the basement at that time. But a few years later, we started to see a slight amount of water coming in, and this is after the library had started to be built, but I wasn't taking that it was connected. We installed a sump pump in the basement, which I want to make note is a 3-foot, I hope you know what 3 feet is, hole was dug through solid limestone, and it's true, we're all solid limestone here in 96. This sump pump continually runs with the spring runoff, or if the power happens to get shut down after a heavy storm, it fills right up to the top of the 3 feet. And I know because I've had to bail it out many times. This last year, the sump pump worked in December and January because of all the heavy rainfall, and this is very unusual, so we can't go by what weather should be because of it changes all the time. And I want to reiterate what we said before, this block is solid limestone. So water seepage comes through the cracks both on the surface and on the underground and heads from here towards Lake Ontario. The engineering studies were all done on the upper half of the block, close to the new residence, with no test holes done on the lower half of this block. And remember, we're on a hill and I'm still on the top of the hill. In the spring, houses bordering Union Street get water pooling at the base of their gardens, and the surface water runs off and continues down through gardens on the Albert Street over to Collingwood and drains into Queen's Crescent. We are told that this was just groundwater and not to worry, but the definition of groundwater is water is held in soil or rock, especially below the water table, which is on the upper surface. So the water we have has both surface and underground sources. Now, can I have the pictures showing up now, please? Can I have? So this first picture is what happens after one of our very wet summers. This is the properties of 120 and 108 Albert Street. The water from there then pools down to my garden, which is the next picture, along the front when it shows up. That, yes, there. Goes along my fence line. And this is the spring, so it's not as much rain. We didn't have as much rain, so it's not as deep. But the deepest part is usually about 2 feet, even if I try to fill in. It then runs downhill into the next property, which goes into Queen's Crescent. It's the next picture, please. The sewer, and you can't quite see the sewer, but it's right by the house there. So this is a major travel way. We have water every spring, every year. And that has been regardless of whether we had the blasting or not, this has always been there. And even in dry winters, we still have the runoff. The reports say that there will be drainage around the buildings, but is this going to help the water that seeps underground? Can you guarantee that the residents will not change the underwater direction and further flood our gardens or basements? Would it not be advisable for more engineering studies to be done further down this block so that residents are not flooded out of their homes because of the incompetence of not doing further water studies? You can be sure when building begins, they will hit solid limestone and drilling or blasting will occur, which will again change the water flow, especially to the properties further south. King Street often has flooding at the bottom of Collingwood Street after a heavy rainfall, and there will be even more water if this problem is not fixed. Your quality control reports that there will be non-polluted runoff. How can that be if you pave the laneway, have delivery trucks spewing oil, and will be using salt, sand, or other chemicals to clear the ice and snow? This will definitely affect the quality water runoff in the spring ponds or into our basements. And this is something that we actually had stopped when the Queens tried to put a parking lot proposal in that area in 2001 too. And it was stopped because of
30 seconds, please. Thank you.
I'm almost finished.
No problem.
The study seems to imply that the water is runoff from buildings and that their proposed drainage will be redirected. We're not talking about surface water, and we would really like to have a guarantee that our properties or basements won't be flooded, won't be further flooded as a result of the building of the residents. Happen. Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have any further hands up?
Yes, there's two hands, just 1 second. Actually, they just disappeared, but I'm just going to check it. Oh, they're there. They're back. All right, 1 second. We're going to go to Gail Meadows.
Thank you. Gail, the floor is yours. If you can identify your address.
Right, my name is Gail Meadows, and I also live at 134 Albert Street, like it's right next door to 130/120 development. My concern is about those two properties that are being joined together and further joined to the back laneway, which I consider mine, all the way down to the residence. So I want to know why those two properties are included in a site plan, especially when you say that what is the real purpose for these two properties being joined through my back lane to the residence? And that's my big question. I want to, on page 7 of your report, it says that there are currently 2 university-owned buildings located at 120 and 130 Queen Street, but I think that's a typo. It should be Albert Street. The use of the former was not being proposed to change as part of this application. So the question is, if nothing's going to change, why is it part of the site plan? But obviously there has to be some plan in the back of somebody's mind for these two pieces of property, because obviously they want to just carry on and do more development there, and I want to know what it is, and I would like to know what their long-term plan is. I don't accept that there will be no change in these two properties. Something has to change. Even if they keep them the way they are, they're going to have to be upgraded to become livable. Currently, these two buildings at 120 and 130, and in fact, I'm not even sure anybody even lives in 120 anymore, but I can tell you right now, 130 is like, I can look out my window right now and see their back door. And if they're going to be habitable, they have to be rendered so. They are currently decrepit, rat infested, and I have photos of the rats going into the house, under the house, and they're barely suitable for human dwellings. So in this report, you also say that you want to keep it in the neighborhood mode. And this is like so far out from what the rest of the neighborhood stands for. These are decrepit old buildings. And not only that, they're badly maintained, and the yards are a source of noxious weeds for the adjoining gardens. I spend more time picking noxious weed out of their garden than I do out of my own, so they won't go to seed. If I get off the lawnmower, the grass doesn't get cut. So there are leaves piled up and there's garbage. You wouldn't believe how bad these properties are. And there are rats going and coming under the basement. So something has to change, even if it is fixing these up to make them habitable. Meanwhile, they say nothing's going to change there. My biggest problem is what's happening in the back lane. As the way it's shown on the plan, it's coming from the residence, it's coming up to this 130 and 120, and so it's become a road. It's going to become a laneway. You're going to have students walking down there on their way to their cafeteria or their classes. Some portion of those students are going to be going down that lane. They're going to be cutting through this yard. Is this going to become a new laneway alongside my house? Is it going to become a road access to Albert Street? So I want to know, obviously there's a plan. Obviously there's a thought process going on here. And I think we should know about that now. There's going to be a change one way or the other. I suspect the real plan is to knock these buildings over. But if they're staying for another 2-3 years, maybe they should be made habitable. And I would like to see a mobility study as well. These students are coming out, they're coming down. There's going to be bikes, there are going to be cars if the laneway is made as wide as they say they're going to make it. So this is going to become a new road. And it's going to be right next to my property. And it's going to be access to Albert Street. There are going to be people like, there are going to be people who are visiting students there, friends visiting students. There are going to be food delivery places. You think students don't order out and get pizza and things delivered? And where are those cars going to come and go? So I think I really need to know what the long-term plan is if they've got this on their site plan now. To have it just sitting there makes no sense to me. That's my question. What's the long-term plan? Tell me what you plan to be in 10 years from now. Is this going to be knocked down? Is this going to be a parking lot? What is it going to be? I need to know. That's my question.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure our staff or the Queen's representatives will be able to answer your questions. So thank you very much. Who's next?
Next, we have Shirley Bailey. Go ahead, Shirley. Your microphone is live.
Thank you, committee. Thank you for the opportunity to make comments. Can I just check that you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Great.
Perhaps move slightly closer to your mic.
Yes.
Thank you.
As I said, my name's Shirley Bailey. I'm speaking on behalf of the Frontenac Heritage Foundation, and our address is Post Office Box 27, Kingston. We are pleased to see that the new staff report dated June 18th now includes on pages 12 and 13 information related to heritage issues. While the matter of height and density cannot be considered here, I'd like to remind committee members about the repeated policies in the official plan, which call one's attention to compatibility, matters which go beyond matters of height and density. Section 237 of the strategic section of the official plan speaks to conserving our cultural heritage resources, and 273 lists the compatibility provisions, which in our view have not been adequately addressed, including loss of privacy, increased levels of noise, reduction in the ability to enjoy the property or the normal amenity associated with it, visual intrusion, etc. Section 358, a section of the institutional designation, lists 10 development criteria, including subsection A, compatibility with the height, massing, bulk, and scale of adjacent residential buildings. C, compatibility with the architectural or heritage character of the surrounding buildings and area. And D, design and site of proposed buildings or structures to preserve as much open space as possible, etc. Have these criteria been satisfactorily addressed? For example, what kind of noise will the large mechanical penthouse have on the many homes along Collingwood Street? Section 7 of the city's plan deals with cultural heritage resources, and 717 says that a heritage impact study can be required for any development application, yet this was not done. A heritage impact assessment would have assessed the heritage value of all the buildings in the immediate area, the partial demolition of 142 and 144 Albert Street as shown on the demolition plan, and the demolition of 3 other houses on Albert Street. People have had to refer to the 1998 heritage study to gather information on the value of the affected buildings, and also the importance of the Albert Street streetscape. Under urban design section 8.6, which deals with new development, it starts with the city requires the design of new development to be visually compatible with surrounding neighborhoods and areas of cultural heritage value or interest through its site plan control review. And on it goes, repeating the sense of the criteria noted already. And finally, in terms of the official plan, the proposal in our view does not meet section 9532, which guides site plan control review, again with several criteria, but requiring that, quote, the city will use the process of site plan control review to B, encourage proposed development to relate compatibly to the scale, character, and siting of abutting development, C, minimize impacts on abutting uses, end of quote, and so on. In this case, the use of the wraparound laneway, the ownership of which still seems to be disputed and which now the university is threatening to expropriate, uses a setback requirement from a 1975 zoning bylaw, which does not provide an adequate separation between uses. The claim is made that this project complies with the 2014 campus master plan. The staff report on page 18 includes a statement regarding that plan from Queens, but does not include the reference from page 2 of the master plan on page 236, which calls for a minimum of 2-story and a maximum of 4-story development in precinct 2A, which this is, not 5-story development. The site plan control process is the only mechanism for the residents of this neighborhood to ensure that the new development is compatible. And yet the proposal has changed little from the 2 public information meetings held in 2019, after which numerous concerns were filed. This is the sole opportunity for these residents to be heard on this matter, which will forever change their backyard environment with overlook, lights, noise, and more pedestrian trespass. The city is undertaking policy work which is promoting intensification in the residential areas of the city. The Central Kingston Growth Strategy is one of these projects, as is the Density by Design project. As a municipality, we need to find ways to ensure development is compatible with the neighboring homes. 5 stories next to single-family dwellings, whether some of them are used for student housing or not, deserve more
3
harmonious
seconds,
development.
please.
Thank you. Than
Thank
this.
you.
The bump up provision allows the planning committee to make a decision on this matter, and we strongly recommend that it not be approved in principle, but referred back to the planning department for more review to determine ways that the development can be made more compatible with the neighboring residential buildings. Issues such as vegetative buffer, fencing to prevent cut-through pedestrian traffic, lighting, and the mechanical penthouse on the top of the 5th floor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next on the agenda?
Mr. Chair, we'll now go to Ms. Milne, and followed by that, we'll go to Don Mitchell.
Thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes, we can.
Hello, Annie.
Hi, Jim. Good to see you. I'm at 108 Albert, which is just down the street. And I'm a Queen's alumni. My husband's a Queen's alumni. My kids are. They went to KC. We've been here for 30 years. Two things. One, I'm concerned with the different laws that Queens has compared to other people, taxpayers, voters, me. For instance, I've had notices on my front door from the city telling them to tidy up my lawn because my garden is kind of wild. I planted millions of trees, and I know it's trendier now to have these English gardens, but the fact that the city would regulate whether I have a railing on my front steps and whether my grass is shorter. I actually called the city and said that everything in my yard is either deliberately planted or deliberately left. Come and look, please come and look at my house. I love it. And the other thing to come and look at is the black locust that's slated for coming down, one of the 4. It's in bloom right now. Go look at it. It's like I swear you won't cut it down. And the second thing, so it's the different regulations for Queens and for regular taxpayers who we're paying as taxpayers, we're paying your salary, we're paying Queens lawyers' salaries. So the second thing is on Donald's piggyback is not just the pedestrian influx here, but it's the cars that will be involved. Since they built the parking lot, it's a nightmare of congestion on this street with kids unloading at daycare and students. It's a death trap waiting to happen. Kids on bikes, and there's so much traffic from the parking lot, which we went through a big debate with the city trying to get them to, for a School of Urban Planning and Environmental Science, they're very hypocritical to put a parking lot right where they put it instead of encouraging public transit and other modes for pollution and things. So this 300 plus new people right there, there'll be millions of Uber Eats and friends, and there'll be a car for every kid in that building. I guarantee it. And I'm wondering where they're going to go. So that's my concern is just the impact of both those things. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Annie. Who else has a hand up?
Mr. Mitchell is queued up and almost ready.
Sounds
Good evening.
All right.
Hello, Donald.
Good evening. The Sydenham District Association Board members and local residents thank Councillor Stroud and Council for provisioning a city-led public meeting for this application. Ostensibly for the site plan control elements alone, but we hold that all development aspects are interrelated. Our primary purpose in communicating with the Planning Committee tonight is to indicate on public city record our association's support of the neighbors that have raised ongoing concerns, adverse impacts, and issues that, in our consideration, still remain unaddressed to the perspective and satisfaction of those people that live in proximity to this large-scale structure. The SDA board acknowledges that zero public engagement is required to action this university development as it exists fully within e-zoning. It's deemed zone compliant and thereby compatible. It's debatable whether those standards are appropriate from all viewpoints. So in our opinion, it's vital that the site plan control exceeds electively by the applicant the minimum requirements to mitigate extensively what we all know are extreme disparities of scale and massing. Noting this block contains 15 potential heritage properties. Regardless of success, our association is advocating for these adversely impacted community members to be generously considered. We uphold their importance and the importance of their role in maintaining the diverse living system of this character neighborhood and its surrounding area. And we caution that our city requires the continued presence and goodwill of the widest diversity of residents within each defined residential neighborhood. Site plan control success for this development, sadly, for many residents, may be too little to prevent the compounding impacts of the higgledy-piggledy developments and spot zone projects in this neighborhood and its surrounding streets. Absent Queen's willingness to undertake relocation or significant redesign that would add strategic height, but increase setback with opportunity for more effective buffer, we're left with only the elements of site plan control. And regrettably, that leaves little to work with to protect existing area residents. For this reason, it would seem appropriate for the committee and council to ensure that those most affected retain public opportunity to influence the site plan control right up and until the structure reveals the full magnitude of its impacts. Could a mechanism be intentioned amicably to ensure arising issues get addressed after conditional approval? If so, how could that be made to work? Could the recommendation be amended or deferred until a later date? The SDA board adds our voice to the homeowner concerns. SDA members have also reached out to us expressing how disappointed they are to see the impact of Queen's decision. Now, recognizing that we can submit our more technical points by email afterwards, we have left those thoughts until last. In our remaining time, if any, we'll perhaps mention one or two bullet points with submission to follow. Thanks in advance for your patience, time, and consideration of our perspectives. Here's a few points. Are there plans to mitigate the sunlight reflections from the 72 windows and large portions of glazing on the western elevation of the residence? Has it been modeled, and were screens or covers recommended to reduce producing glare into neighboring homes and properties? Assuming there is zero requirement to mitigate, can this be a consideration and requirement added to site plan control? Do the external windows of the residences open? And if so, what is the likely combined impact of the amplified and acoustic noise that might be produced by those windows? Does the noise bylaw apply? Could site plan control regulate the building's generation of noise and activity? Has the nighttime light spill of the combined windows of the residence been modeled? Are there indications of what kind of light pollution area homes might be adversely impacted with during the night if windows are not shaded and all lights are on? Has this been considered in the choice of materials or finishes of the glazing and windows? How will the articulation and choice of materials perform to mitigate noise pollution, transferring from other properties off the 5-story residence and reflecting back into neighboring properties? Has this been studied? And are there synthetic products, coverings, and acoustic dampening materials that could be applied to reduce the refraction of sound waves? Will there be site plan control specifications that ensure the laneway cannot be blocked by vehicle or person at any time? And how is that enforced? Has there been any discussion of the pre-finished corrugated steel panel's dark brown color? And should it be a color that blends more discreetly into the sky rather than the dark brown, which will presumably be contrasted against the skyline and thereby more noticeable? And are the diverse plantings anticipated to grow to their full height? Given the trees, it could be a range of 6 to 75 feet, depending upon the site conditions. Could coniferous plantings be interspersed within deciduous trees on the north, west, and south sides to ensure winter performance and year-round foliage on all sides of the structure? And has an irrigation component been added to the plantings that might ensure greater success of the trees? Will the requirements of site plan be that the trees must always be present or replaced? Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Don. Is there anybody else with a hand up?
Councillor Neal, one resident submitted some slides but have not yet raised their hand. So I'm just going to check in with them to see if they wish.
Sure, thanks.
There's. Go ahead, Ms. Murphy. Oh, sorry, I'll just get you to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes, we can.
Very good, thank you. Yes, so we can start with my slides if you like. Actually, my name is Carol Murphy and I own 115 Collingwood Street. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and be heard. As one of the many longtime neighbors who will be directly impacted by this proposed development, I welcome the opportunity to share some of the concerns that many of us have. We view ourselves as stewards of our neighborhood, and our goal is to protect and save what we value about where we live. We ask that Queens also be a steward of the neighborhood as well as we share this community together. A little history of my property at 115 Collingwood. My grandparents bought the property in 1938 and the house was built at their direction. My grandparents, mother, and now myself have all enjoyed living here. I have been here since 1982. My mother is alive and well and at 95 and is an excellent historian of the neighborhood. My property has always had a fenced enclosed backyard with all abutting properties. 119 Collingwood, 113 Collingwood, and 120 and 130 Albert. Mature growth trees have always occupied the backyard along with gardens and play structures. The issue for me is the confusion created by conflicting exhibits, dependencies, and documents. My goal is clarity, transparency, and answers for my questions. I took pictures of my yard just to give you a perspective. So this is 115 Collingwood Street backyard looking north into the laneway, showing the original fence, the old growth tree, and an elevation change. This is facing east, showing the fence line and backing onto 120 and 130 Albert Street backyards, again with fencing. This is looking south towards Queens Crescent, and again, looking onto my neighbors who all have enclosed backyards. If we look at the site plan that was included in the Dash website, my house is represented by the star, and I am not included in their plan. The laneway ends before me. Another document, this one was from Cunningham Swan, and again, 115 with the star is not included in the diagram. However, on the planning committee meetings, if you look at the star, I am included with the diagram, and the laneway comes right down to my property. So what are my goals is, and why I think we need this deferral and why they have the issue, is we need to clear up these inconsistencies and in the documents, and to get clarification for what the actual plans are. Even in tonight, my property was represented in two different ways. It was on one plan and not on the other plan. The other issue I have, again, my other neighbors spoke to that, is 120 and 130 Albert Street, which I back onto. Again, no proposes or changes are planned for them. So my questions for everybody, so the next slide, please. And these are what I would like answered. So why are they being included in this application if nothing is planned? And what would be the purpose of connecting the northern and southern portions of the site via the laneway if nothing is planned for the future? They've clarified that the subject is subject to further site plan review and approval. But personally, what assurances and comfort would be taken from the statement based on what is happening now with the application for 142 and 154 Albert Street? If we had concerns, would we require another bump up in order to be heard? This laneway has not been accessed from 120 and 130 Albert Street to the laneway for the past 82 years in the possession of my family. So my question is, what is the plan? There is a plan for this property and we need transparency here. The other question I had is the consolidation, which the council approved on January 21st of the properties. What kind of considerations would require this to be necessary? And again, remembering that no further changes are planned. And why is the laneway needed to be part of this consolidation? I know that they did not own 138 Albert Street at the time of January 21st. And then my question is, why is that not being included in the consolidation? I know Ms. Wood has said that that adding the property would make it no longer compliant for zoning. So I would like her to clarify why there would be a change in the zoning by adding in that property. It also says, sorry for the next slide, the private laneway to serve as a vehicle access route to the loading zone and garbage collection, which is located at the southwest of the residence, which is at just above 134 Albert. So if the only intended use of the laneway is an access route to that, why does it need to go as far down as 120 and 130 Albert Street? The other question is the bylaw restrictions on the size and the type of vehicles that can access this laneway. And is there room for another car to pass? We don't believe there is. And then what was going to happen? Are they going to have to back out the laneway? And how is this going to happen? Or is there a pullover so that there are many people who use this laneway, not just the service vehicles, and how will they be accommodated? The other question I had was the setback from the rear property line to the closest point to the residence line. So am I correct in assuming that the laneway is included in the rear property line? It says it accommodates the laneway. So what I'm asking is, if it doesn't include the laneway, what would be the proper numbers for this? And is there enough of a setback for this building if the laneway is not included in the rear property line calculations? So what I'm asking from you for the planning committee tonight is to ensure that all of these issues are resolved before approval for such a significant and impactful application is given. It is changing our lives in an unprecedented way, and we will have life-changing implications for many of us.
30 seconds, please.
Choices. This needs to be a consideration in the approval process that serves all of our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clerk, is there anybody else with a hand up?
I am not seeing any, but I will just remind people again that in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, after you hit the participants button, you can click on the raise hand button. Please do so immediately if you wish to speak. And for the member that is on the phone, please hit *9 if you wish to speak. But seeing no hands, I'll say going once and going twice, and I will return to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And that was quite a collection of questions. I'm going to just open it up if there's a staff person who feels that there's a specific question they can address. Just raise your hand. If there's a Queens person who feels the same, just raise your hand and the floor will be yours. And we'll make sure that we answer all of the questions that have been asked. So the floor is
Mr. Chair, I have Ms. Agnew and then Ms. Wood. So we'll go first to Ms. Agnew.
Perfect.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Can I suggest that perhaps Ms. Wood and her team start by addressing the questions that have come forward that are more appropriate for them to respond to, and city staff will follow with what remains in terms of the questions that were asked during the public commenting portion.
That makes sense to me. That's why you're a planner and I'm not. But yes, let's follow that.
Great, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, firstly, thank you to everyone for your comments and your feedback. I've been furiously writing here to get down all of the notes, all of the questions, all of the concerns, and I'm hoping I don't miss anything. I don't think I will, so just bear with me and my team as we try to get through these comments. I think I'll probably just start from the beginning and work my way through just to make sure I don't miss anything. So I think at the beginning we heard questions and concerns around safety and building ingress and egress, and whether this many students in one location presents some sort of fire or emergency access concern or issue. I think just like any other residence building, any other apartment building, any other new construction for that matter, regardless of the density, is required to meet both the Ontario Building Code requirements and the Ontario Fire Code requirements. So this is a brand new build. So compared to other older residences, I think this structure will present a layout and design that meets all of those requirements, ensures that during an emergency, students are able to exit the building safely. I think certainly there will be an increase in pedestrian circulation in this area. Students will be coming and going from the site throughout the day to get to classes, to go to meals. But I would just note that the 300 some odd students living in this residence, with the exception of, I suppose, an emergency, will be coming and going throughout the day at different times. And we do expect that the local pedestrian network will be able to support these students and their movements. Questions around a seismic exercise. So this isn't a municipal requirement. However, Queens has engaged and has been undertaking for a while now background geotechnical investigations. So essentially, digging test pits, drilling test holes to understand the subsurface conditions, and that all informs their process of not only designing the building and any below grade structures, but also the construction process. So that will continue to occur and will inform that process. I'd also just note that it is quite a small basement level. If you do look through the floor plans, there's a small basement at the south end where we do have the most soil depth. I believe the basement is roughly 30% of the building footprint. So we're not actually going to see that substantial of disturbance to the ground. Concerns and questions around groundwater impacts. So, excuse me one moment here. So we have undertaken, Queens has essentially engaged a consultant to install and monitor several monitoring wells throughout the property. And that was in response to very early feedback we received, I think about a year ago, about concerns of localized flooding. And so we've engaged a qualified professional to install these test wells, to monitor the wells from the fall all the way through to the spring thaw, because this is generally the wettest time of year. And what they found was that those wells did experience an increased rate of recharge right after heavy rainfalls. And so, and this can be, expected to an extent, because the development site doesn't currently have any stormwater management measures in place. So during heavy rainfalls, water flows over land, which is what we saw in some of the pictures, and then slowly infiltrates into the groundwater. And so through, our civil engineer designing this site has introduced a series of stormwater management measures, in particular on the lane, paving it, curbing it, and installing, I believe there's 13 catch basins that will collect rainwater and divert it to the municipal storm sewer, as opposed to the current situation, which is just rainwater collecting, running over land, and then just soaking in wherever the low spots are located. And to the point and concerned around quality water runoff, as part of this, as I said, the rainwater will be collected and diverted to municipal storm sewers, as opposed to having salty water just infiltrate into the earth. So there have been, and I'm slightly hesitant because they're, I suppose, more so legal questions and not so much site plan land use related questions, but I do appreciate the concern around why did we merge the parcel that is the right of way, as well as 120 and 130 Albert Street. It is Queen's practice to consolidate lands to prepare them for development. And 138 Albert Street, which is the property immediately to the south, this was acquired well after land consolidation occurred. it is anticipated that at some point in the future, it's likely that that parcel will also be merged with Queen's owned lands. We did go through the part lot lift process to bring the right of way to merge it with the development block, largely because this process allows for Queens to convey registered rights of way over the laneway to property owners who don't have those existing rights without the need to go through the Committee of Adjustment for municipal consent. So it is a process that can more easily facilitate establishing rights of way to property owners who don't currently enjoy right of way registered on title. There were also questions around will there be changes to the two retained buildings? Interior wise, absolutely. There will be significant changes. These buildings are being completely retrofitted to be converted from previous residential uses to integrate into the student residence. The exterior, there will be changes because the Queens is committed to restoring these buildings. So they've engaged a local heritage consultant, Andre Scheineman, to advise on things like window restoration and other features of the building to try to bring them back. So there will be some minor exterior changes for restoration and some moderate structural changes at the backs of these buildings in order to physically connect them to the new structure. What is the long-term plan for the lane and this site? Well, I think the long-term plan for the lane is also the short-term plan, which is to improve it, to pave it. We're also proposing to widen it to be the full extent of the easement that's registered. Currently, it's a hard packed gravel, and it's not actually as wide as the easement area. So as part of this, it will be widened, which will help with circulation to and from, which was another concern that we heard. And I'd say the long-term plan for the site and for all of Queen's buildings are to be consistent with the Queen's master plan. And this development certainly is consistent with that plan. I'll jump now to questions or concerns related to official plan policies. So I do want to turn it to our heritage consultant briefly to speak to compatibility. But before I do, I just want to briefly touch on adverse impacts, which was raised. A noise study has been prepared, which looks at things like mechanical equipment noise and whether those noise sources are going to negatively impact surrounding uses. We've also prepared and submitted a lighting study to the City of Kingston for review, which looks at issues like light spillover. And of course, shadowing is another thing that I think we've talked about already. So, adverse impacts are something that we have been very cognizant of, we have been looking at and have integrated into the design of this building. So maybe I'll just briefly turn it over to Mr. Julian Smith, if the clerk would do so, and maybe he can speak a little bit to compatibility, particularly in the heritage context.
Hello, can you?
Mr. Smith, your mic is live.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I just wanted, a few words on compatibility. The Queen's University Master Plan sets out the concept of the cultural landscapes of both the campus and the surrounding neighborhoods. And these cultural landscapes have distinctive characters. And this site happens to be one of the transition zones between the campus, the cultural landscape of the campus, which is very much concerned with landscape, with pedestrian movement, with street trees and so on. But it is institutional buildings. It's a larger scale. It's a different kind of scale of development. And then Collingwood, Beverly, Kensington moving to the west, which is a clear residential neighborhood. And this building provides a point of transition. So the compatibility for this building has to operate in both directions. There's a compatibility with the evolving campus, particularly as the parking lot site gets redeveloped and there's the compatibility to the west. I think there's been a real effort with retaining these two houses and not just the facades, which I have to say was a starting point. City recommending we keep the facades, and we've in fact kept the block of the buildings themselves, 142 and 144, so that we're avoiding the facadism problem that places like Toronto have. And these houses are important in that, in terms of this compatibility. And mention was made of going back, why isn't there a heritage impact statement? We had to go back to the 1998 study. Well, the 1998 study, which was Hal Kalman's study under Commonwealth of this whole street, very detailed. I just wanted, his recommendation at the end of that was that 96 Albert was important and should be retained, and Queen's University has every intention of retaining that. The other building on that block he suggested be retained was 144. He said those are the two best buildings on the block. And he says new development, and I'll quote from him directly, should avoid these two properties, work around the isolated house in mid-block, maintain the existing setback, retain the street trees, and work with the curving street alignment. I think Queens has gone beyond that. They've, in fact, we're keeping 142 and 144, but I think there's certainly an effort to respect the cultural heritage values of Albert as a place of transition. And Collingwood is one kind of street. Albert and places as you move eastward become very much part of a campus landscape. So the compatibility question, I think, is really going both ways. And the master plan says these transitional buildings are important. And I think this one is, we've worked very hard to make it that transition. So it's not going to be compatible in some ways in either direction. It's not a full institutional building. Queens might have preferred not to keep the older residences in terms of cost and so on. But I would say there's a really concerted effort to say, how do you provide this compatibility to the west and compatibility to the east? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And just building on that a little bit more, because I realize that there are many facets to the compatibility discussion, both heritage as well as official plan policy, as well as built forum. I know one of the speakers spoke to section 9.5.32 of the official plan and whether this development conforms to those policies. It's a list A through J, which I won't go through in detail, but essentially it's a list of criteria for evaluating site plan control applications and reflects a lot of the themes that we've already been discussing this evening, including ensuring things like compatibility, accessibility, mitigating negative impacts, safety and access, landscaping standards, stormwater management, etc. And these have all been reviewed and considered through the evolution of this plan and through the technical review process with city staff. As well, there was a comment on height contemplated in the master plan, campus master plan, which speaks to up to 4 stories here. I would just highlight that the campus master plan, when contemplating stories, is with respect to academic stories. A typical academic building story is roughly 4 to 5 meters, whereas a residential use that you'd see is typically a building height or a floor height of 3 meters. So in this case, since we're having smaller floor to ceiling floor heights, we've managed to get, 5 stories or 5 levels into a 4-story mass of an academic building. There were some comments on regulating landscaping on some adjacent properties, which I'm not going to speak to. There was a comment about concerns with increased traffic. There's no parking proposed on the site, 1 loading space only. These will be first-year students, so it's expected that they'll be walking everywhere on campus as they attend Queen's. I do know there were some questions and comments around, I guess, the fundamentals of the site plan control process and whether there's a need to change that process and whether those changes need to occur before the site plan is approved. I think I'm probably not, I'm not going to get into those details. I don't think that's, from our perspective, part of tonight's discussion. You know, we have applied for site plan control, I think in September, and are subject to the requirements and criteria of the site plan control bylaw that applied at that time. I did already speak to noise briefly. I appreciate there's noise from mechanical equipment and potentially noise from students as well. Dorm rooms will have, only the dorm rooms will have windows that open a maximum of 4 inches to ensure fresh air flow. Students do have a code of conduct for noise and respecting neighbors. So I think Queens will, you know, continue to do their part to ensure that students are abiding by that code of conduct and appropriate behavior. I think we've kind of addressed this already, but concerns about what if Queens makes changes later down the road that don't reflect what's being presented tonight. I would just reiterate that, you know, all of these plans and all of these proposed development aspects are going to be registered on title in the site plan agreement. So any deviations from that moving forward will trigger a site plan modification and this exact same process that we're in today. Forgive me, I'm just going through all of my notes. I want to make sure that I don't miss anything. I think there were comments as well on landscaping and types of trees and the extent of their foliage, particularly around the time of year. We have been evolving our landscape plan now for, you know, almost a year. And a big component of that is selecting caliper sizes for new plantings that are, well, one, meet the minimum requirements of the site plan control guidelines. There are minimum size and height, caliper size height requirements. So all of our plantings are meeting or exceeding those requirements. Our landscape architect wanted to ensure that we're going large enough that we achieve, you know, the benefits of that screening and foliage as early as possible, but also not starting too big and risk losing some of those young trees. So we have selected a range of trees. We have focused on deciduous trees because that canopy and that foliage does provide such a full screen. There are, of course, we're maintaining the majority of street trees along Albert Street, many of which are very mature and offer a significant amount of tree canopy along the streetscape. So I appreciate that comment, and that's been a really significant consideration as part of this site plan. And again, we are proposing 22, that the end results, there are 22 more trees going to be left than before when we came in. I believe that covers everything. I think that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Agnew, are there any staff concerns you'd like to speak to?
Mr. Chair, we do have a hand from Mr. Lasco in the city's engineering department. If you'd like to go to him.
Mr. Lasco, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, and through you to the rest of the group, just to add to Ms. Wood's comments earlier respecting stormwater management and some of the work that the applicant has done on site, keeping in mind that the site plan control process is intended to make certain that we understand, in essence, how the water works now and how it's proposed to work after the proposal is put in place in terms of the volumes of water that move with the site and the quality of it. The proposal, or as the applicant has noted, the proposal is ongoing through technical review at the moment. We've seen plenty of stormwater management work to date, and we're continuing to work through those details. 2 points of note, we have confidence that the applicant can meet and actually exceed the city's requirements for stormwater management. In particular, we do get involved with applicants with respect to reducing their flows from site in downtown locations. In this particular case, it appears that the applicant will be able to do so up to at least at the moment, up to 15%, and we will be working with them to try to get up to 20% reductions. The other thing of note is a portion of the site moves to the south in the way that the property drains. The applicant has acknowledged this through their work and is making adjustments so that that water no longer flows that direction, but is caught on the subject lands and moves out to the road in a more in a different way to outlet to the public realm, to the roadway. So from that perspective, the applicant has indeed provided information that shows they can meet the city's requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other hands up?
I do not see any at this time, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I believe all of the questions have been addressed. Did any staff
Mr. Chair, I see Ms.
Yes. Go ahead. Who was it?
Hello. Hi, it's Andrea Gummo speaking. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I did just want to speak to the concern about the requirement for a heritage impact statement. And I wanted to clarify, the OP does give us the ability to request a heritage impact statement for pretty much any planning application, which is excellent for a city like Kingston with so many valuable heritage resources. Now, in this case, we actually have the information available already that would normally be provided by a heritage impact statement because of the research that Queens has done previously and the work that the city has done in consultation with Queens for the update to the heritage easement agreement that applies to campus. So we actually do have lots of information on the heritage resources that are on this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gummo. Any other hands?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Speak.
I'm sorry.
Ms. Marley would like to speak now.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jenna.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on a couple of the legal questions, I believe there was a question regarding whether we could condition site plan control approval on consultation with the public. The city is not permitted under the Planning Act to site plan control approval on consultation. So any condition.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you move a little closer to the mic?
Sure.
We're getting a little scrambled.
Is that better?
Much better.
Excellent. Okay. I was just saying that we are not permitted under the Planning Act to include conditions that would require public consultation. That would be an unenforceable condition, so we would not be able to include that in the site plan control agreement. On the part lot control question, Ms. Wood summarized that very well. The purpose of that bylaw was twofold. The first purpose was to consolidate the properties that are owned by Queens to allow them to develop them as a single parcel. And the second purpose was to allow Queens to convey right-of-ways to users of the laneway that don't currently have a registered right-of-way. In the absence of the part lot control bylaw, Queens would need consent from the Committee of Adjustment in order to grant right-of-ways over the laneway. So this was a very technical process. And then my final point on conformity with the official plan, I would reiterate that the conformity with official plan exercise is addressed at the time the zoning bylaw is passed. So as previously indicated, this application does comply with the zoning bylaw. So under the Planning Act, once the zoning bylaw is passed, the bylaw is deemed to be in conformity with the official plan.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, we do have, one additional comment from Ms. Grant, the planner for the file.
The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I think Ms. Wood and my colleagues did a pretty good job answering all of the questions, I think, based on my notes. I just wanted to touch briefly on, there were a couple comments related to impacts on pedestrian impacts in the area. And just as a course of practice, the city typically doesn't require an impact study related to pedestrian use. The city generally encourages pedestrian use of sidewalks, but in this location specifically, there is a sidewalk on both sides of Albert Street here, and it's about a half a block from a signalized intersection. So we don't have any concerns related to pedestrian impacts. There are also clear access routes on site to the building, which have also, I just wanted to note, been reviewed by our Municipal Accessibility Advisory Committee. So they have had a chance to look at the site plan and make any comments on that. There were just a couple comments about noise and lighting and how that's reviewed through site plan. I think it's addressed fairly well in their report, but there has been a noise study as well as a lighting study completed by the applicant, and which has been submitted and reviewed. Any conditions related to the noise study, which relate directly to provincial guidance around noise, would be included in the site plan control agreement. So the city has some enforceability there in terms of those mechanical noises, as well as the lighting plan would also be attached to the site plan control agreement, which has been reviewed to ensure there's no lighting spill off from exterior lighting onto neighboring residential properties. I also just wanted to provide a little bit of clarification. I think there was maybe some confusion in the mapping related to the property lines at the back of 120 and 130 Albert Street. I just wanted to confirm that the site plan drawings are based on a legal survey of that property. So those do represent the legal property lines and will be addressed through the site plan agreement. So those drawings do represent the property lines. And tied to that, I also just wanted to confirm that the legal property line is as per the legal survey, which shows the north and east side of the laneway as the property line, which does mean that the rear and the side yard setback does include the laneway within that yard. I think that's all for me. If we missed anything, please let us know.
Great, thank you very much. There will be an opportunity for members of the committee to ask questions once the recommendation is on the floor. Are there any other hands on the horizon?
I am not seeing any, Mr. Chair.
Okay, then I'll declare this public portion of the meeting over and we'll go back into committee. And if somebody would care to move or second the recommendation, that will give us an opportunity to ask questions if we like. Councillor Hill moving, Councillor Osanek seconding. So, yes, and I see Councillor Osanek's hand. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask some follow-up questions where I didn't really hear the answer that some of the members of the public asked. For the cafeteria, two questions I have about food. So where there's no cafeteria in this residence, they're going to have to go to get food. Does that mean crossing Albert Street, or is there one of the food services on the same side of Albert Street as this residence?
That would be a question for Queen's rep, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Is there?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I believe there are food services both on the east and west side of Albert Street, so students will have the option. But yes, I think the majority of food options will be to the east and will require crossing Albert Street in order to access those services. There is, I would note, an intersection with a light. I would say roughly within 30 meters of the subject site.
Okay, thanks. I do think in the morning, and that's when you're going to get the daycare traffic and the traffic of staff, going to Queens, and the traffic of just students, going to their 8 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. in the morning classes. I do think 300 students having to cross Albert Street, there's going to be issues there. I can already see that Councillor Stroud will probably be getting complaints to send to staff about that. One of the residents had the question about pizza delivery and Swiss Chalet and Uber Eats, all of that. So I just didn't hear the answer. So any deliveries like that sort of thing, like not, linen, for example, but any deliveries for food or drop-offs, the cars would be parking on Albert Street then, with their four-way flashers going. Is that what you predict, Queens?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Gotsis had raised his hand previously as well as Ms. Wood. So maybe we'll go to Mr. Gotsis first and then Ms. Wood.
Hi, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to clarify with respect to the dining options. There's actually quite a few different dining options. The Leonard Hall cafeteria, which was one of the main dining halls, is just south of that. So that doesn't require any crossing of the street. Students also have the option to cross the street at the lights and go to Vic Hall, where there's one in the basement. We can go further south and then cross there and also go to the other dining facilities in our other residences that are further east. So there are a variety of options, and the intent is that students disperse and don't all go to the same one. As we don't have dining halls, it isn't our practice within each residence, but it's built on capacity. I hope that helps to clarify. Thank you.
And next we'll go to Ms. Wood.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, I don't have anything to add. Mr. Goat.
Thank you.
So for deliveries for pizza and whatnot, like where did those deliveries? They're going to be parking on Albert Street.
Ms. Wood.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I think I think we would encourage all deliveries to happen at the designated loading space. So maybe that's something that we need to take back to Queens as part of student standard protocol for ordering these types of foods, so that we do take advantage of the existing service lane and have those pick up and drop offs there instead of right on Albert.
That would be perfect. Thank you for that. There were some questions about the landscaping plan and if there would be an irrigation component to try to keep all those trees that are going to be planted alive. Would it be possible to have an irrigation component as part of the site?
Ms. Wood?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Have a detailed landscape plan and through Queens has a grounds management program that deals with things like irrigation of existing landscape gardens and trees. So I think I don't have a specific answer for that question right now, but I think that's all part of Queens grounds management program, that they would need to ensure adequate irrigation of their landscaping.
Okay,
That will
thank you.
be a consideration. So.
And my very last question is to city staff, and for all the trees, since this is site plan, all the trees that are part of this landscaping plan, the site plan that we see tonight, they would be registered on title. Is that correct, to our city staff, so that if any trees do die, they would have to be replaced? That will be on title for the duration that this site is in existence. Is that true?
Go ahead, Ms. Grant.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's right. So the landscape plan would be registered against the site plan control agreement, and the city would take securities, which would include that landscape plan. I don't think the securities apply for the duration of the site, but there is a window, which I think is either 1 year or 2 years, but I can confirm that for you, where the city, the tree would have to be shown to still be living before the securities would be released back to the property owner. That's a standard condition in our agreement, and I don't know the timeline off the top of my head.
Okay. I just thought I was always told at these planning committee meetings that when the trees are registered on title, it's for, the duration forever.
Mr. Chair, we do have a hand raised by Mr. Park, the manager of development approvals. So we will go to him and then Ms. Wood after.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Mr. Park, we'll just need you to confirm unmuting your microphone, please.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, our standard guarantee period for plantings associated with site plans is 1 year, but there is some flexibility within that depending when the plantings take place. So that, I mean, if they're planted late in the fall, we sometimes wait till the following spring, to like a year and a bit to the following spring to make sure they've taken. But as a rule of thumb, there's a one-year warranty period before we do the inspection on the plantings.
And Ms. Wood has further comments to add.
I would concur with my colleagues at the city and would just add that I think Queens is very much committed to the greening of the campus and is committed to maintaining certainly all of the trees proposed on the landscape plan. And you are correct that the landscape plan, which not only includes retained trees, proposed new trees, but it also includes requirements for tree preservation during construction, including protective measures, whether that be fencing or hoarding. So all those requirements are built into the landscape plan that is registered on title, and Queens is committed not only on this site, but has quite a significant tree planting program on campus. So I can tell you that on behalf of Queens, there is a really strong commitment to ensure the long-term health and maintenance of the trees as shown on the landscape plan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, if you would like, we do actually have the planner for the file also has further comments.
Yes, Ms. Grant.
Hi, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thanks, Ms. Wood, for clarifying that. I did also just confirm that with legal that they do require to keep the trees in place in accordance with the landscape plan in perpetuity. So sorry for my confusing answer there. I haven't dealt with that one before.
I'm afraid you'll need to repeat part of that, Ms. Grant. Your audio did cut out.
Oh,
if you can move closer to the mic, that'd be great.
Did you get the beginning? Should I just repeat my sentence?
Just repeat the sentence, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Miss Wood, sorry, did answer the question correctly, and I was confusing in my answer. So I did confirm with our legal counsel that they are required to keep the trees in place in accordance with the landscape plan in perpetuity. So just to confirm that for you, so you know.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from the committee regarding this file? Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These are like the small questions that I could be wrong, but perhaps they weren't answered. And that is regarding there was some concern about the flooding, as you remember. And one of the residents was concerned that there were no test holes done on the lower portion of the property. And I didn't hear that specifically addressed. There's a great deal about, runoff and sewers and so on, and some good answers there. But I'm just wondering if the test holes are appropriately apportioned.
That's probably a question for Mr. Lasko.
Not seeing any hands at the moment, Mr. Chair. Oh, Mr. Lasko's microphone is unmuted, so if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Our understanding is that the amount of testing that was done for the property is suitable to meet the needs for informing all the info that they need for building the building and to understand the subsurface conditions of that. So the info looks appropriate.
Okay. So is the idea, does that mean that there were test holes done in the lower portion, or they're not necessary?
I will let our colleagues at Queens clarify, but my understanding that there was a minimum amount of test holes, and they went above and beyond and did further test holes on the property to make sure they had an understanding of the conditions there.
Right.
And Ms. Wood?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So a number of test holes as well as monitoring wells were drilled throughout the property And I do believe there were a number within the southern portion of the property, and that's largely because that's where the proposed basement is located, is in the south section. So it was, you know, also in Queen's interest to understand the subsurface conditions in this location. So there were test wells dug in the southern portion of the site. I'd also just add that, and just to clarify, we don't mean 120 and 130 Albert Street, the two properties that technically form part of this property but aren't part of the development proposal. When I speak to the southern portion, I mean the southern portion of the development site to the north. I'd also just add that I think the idea with our proposed stormwater management techniques is that that water will be collected and diverted to the municipal sewer system before that water can actually drain into the groundwater. So I think overall, and this is a requirement of the city, which is that stormwater runoff post-development will have to be equal to or less than stormwater runoff post-development.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple other questions that I think might have been missed. The answer to this is probably brief, but there was a question raised about the possibility of the laneway being blocked. And I have to admit, when I looked at the rendering, they showed parked cars in one rendering, and then the building, it's unclear whether cars can pass. There's enough for 2 lanes of traffic there. So the question was, if the laneway is blocked, how do you deal with that? And is the design equipped to take care of the need for passing cars in the laneway?
Who would like to answer that question?
Ms. Wood?
Thank you, and for you, Mr. Chair. The laneway is approximately 6 meters in width, which is a standard drive aisle width for private lands for 2-way traffic. So yeah, certainly if a car is parked in the laneway, that would block one way of traffic. It's you know, not intended that cars will park in the right of way. I know there are some existing parking lot areas on adjacent private lands, but the laneway is proposed to be improved. It's actually proposed to be widened, as I mentioned before, in terms of the paved surface. So it is 6 meters wide. That is sufficient width to allow for 2-way traffic. It meets Ontario Building Code requirements as well. So I don't think we have concerns on that front.
Okay, so it does sort of go back to Councillor Sanding's question about deliveries and like, where there will be stopped traffic. So I just point that out, and there may need to be some other way of dealing with deliveries. Maybe they have to go in the front door or something. It would put them on Albert Street, but it might be better than blocking up the back end. It's something to think about. Finally, it was raised by the Sydenham District Association whether it was possible to have a mechanism to allow public input going forward after site plan control is approved. Is that a possibility?
So we'll go to Miss Morley.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, the next step in the approval process is to have the site plan control agreement prepared. There are specified conditions and types of elements that we can govern in that site plan control agreement. It would not be permissible or enforceable to include a condition in that agreement that further consultation be undertaken.
No, but provision can be made by agreement between the parties. It doesn't have to be written into the site plan control.
Absolutely, and I would let Queen speak to that.
And Ms. Wood?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I think I just need a little bit of clarity on the question here, please.
There's a large series of questions here, which we spent most of the evening answering, and riposting back and forth on. And the question, the request was raised whether there was a possibility of having a mechanism between Queens and the neighbors, where there could be still public input going forward. This is a matter of courtesy, I presume, since we've been told it wouldn't be part of the site plan control, but it's a separate understanding.
Am I on? Oh, thank you. Okay. Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. I think I can say that we've made a significant number of notes this evening on comments received. I think I'd also like to reiterate the extent of public consultation to date, above and beyond statutory requirements as set out in the Planning Act. We've had multiple public open houses starting a year ago, as well as last fall. We've had one-on-one meetings and discussions with nearby property owners to discuss concerns and comments. And I think where we continue to, Queens has continued to be committed to having these discussions with adjacent property owners with concerns related to things like the laneway and potential obstructions during construction. That's a major commitment that Queens is prepared to make moving forward. But we did receive a number of comments in the last year through our consultation that we've undertaken, and we've made changes to the design in response. And I think we're at the point where we will take the comments we've received this evening, and there's an opportunity still before the site plan agreement gets registered for us to work with staff and refine some of those components.
Thank you. Any further questions from committee members? Seeing none, could I ask the vice chair to take, and I just have a couple of very quick questions, a couple of quick comments.
Thank you, and I recognize you.
Thank you. The one question that I think was repeated a couple of times was concerning the inclusion of those two lots where there doesn't seem to be any plans yet. I just wanted to clarify, if I can, probably with Ms. Agnew, if this doesn't give Queens carte blanche to develop those two lots, does it? It would allow any changes to the use of those two lots now would have to come back through a planning process. Is that accurate?
Ms. Graves?
Oh, sorry, Ms. Grant. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, I'll try and field it, and maybe if I'm not successful, we'll step in. So 120 and 130 are included. It is a bit confusing looking at the site plan, but legally this is one property, and a site plan control agreement is registered against the title of the property. So therefore the entire property has to be included in the site plan control agreement. So that's why you're looking at that site, but there's no changes on that site. We have required the drawings to show the existing landscaping, the existing buildings, any existing servicing on the drawings, so that those are registered on the property, and any changes to those would require, at the minimum, a site plan control modification process. If Queens in the future was to propose any sort of redevelopment, the entire site would be opened up for review for zone compliance. So it doesn't, the existing e-zoning that applies to the site wouldn't change, but if they were proposing existing or new development on that site, it would have to comply with the existing zoning. If it didn't, it would open them up to a further Planning Act application.
Thank you. And I do recognize Councillor Hill, but I'll just finish with my couple of questions, if I might. Thank you. The other thing is, I mean, one of our jobs on Planning Committee is always to try to make things better after if it gets approved. Is it accurate, and this, I won't assign this question to anybody, but it is accurate that after this agreement comes to pass, everybody who currently, property owners who currently use the laneway in any capacity, whether they have an easement or not, will be granted an easement. So everybody on all of those adjoining properties that use that laneway will be given permanent access to that. Is that accurate? Not the usual costs to them.
Miss Morley?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Vice Chair, that is correct. The legal description of the laneway states that it's subject to the right-of-way in favor of all of those entitled. There are a number of properties in the area that have a registered right-of-way over the lane. That right-of-way can't be extinguished through this development application. If it's a laneway now, it will remain a laneway following completion of the development. Queens has also indicated that for any properties that abut Collingwood, or any Collingwood properties that abut the lane that do not currently have a registered right-of-way, they are willing to convey that right-of-way at this time. And they were enabled to do so during that part lot control bylaw.
I appreciate that. And my final comment actually is to Ms. Wood, just to correct something. You mentioned with wastewater that there'd be an expectation that the city sewer system would handle some of that. You would need a bylaw amendment to do that, because our bylaw now says property owners cannot divert any water from their property into the sewer system. And staff will correct me if I'm wrong, but I do seem to remember that being a bylaw that we passed.
Miss Wood does have a comment to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, I may need to defer to Mr. Lasco for some additional help here, but I wasn't referring to wastewater, rather stormwater.
Yeah, it's the case with stormwater as well. Mr. Lasco can probably, or one of our planning staff can speak to that, I believe.
I see Mr. Lasco has his hand up. Miss Wood, would you defer to Mr. Lasco on this?
Yes.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the connection to the municipal system through stormwater system specifically is indeed permitted, provided that the applicant can show information that the system can handle it. Perhaps maybe we're thinking about a combined sewer system in that particular instance, which would be a little bit different. So if I've missed the thrust of the question, then you'll correct me.
Yeah, I suggest you look into that, because I remember a lot of concern when that motion first came forward. So maybe a quick email to Mr. Keach might clarify things. So that is it for me. So
you have the chair back.
Turn the chair, and I will recognize Councillor Hill.
Thank you, and through the chair, I had to step out for a second. I may have missed this, but there was one resident who was concerned about a couple of dilapidated or vacant buildings that were on the site that needed to be remediated or addressed. I wondered, was there any comment made on how those buildings are going to be made safe on that site?
There wasn't, and I meant to comment on it. Thank you, Councillor Hill. That's probably a question for Queens, although it may be property standards bylaw enforcement, noise bylaw enforcement kind of issue, but whoever wishes to address that.
Ms. Wood?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. There are a couple of buildings, particularly the ones that are being proposed to be demolished. Some of them are in fairly rough shape. I understand these are rented out to a few community housing groups at the moment. And some of them are actually in such rough shape that they are structurally unsound. And these are the couple buildings that are proposed to be removed and aren't feasible to be retained. The two buildings that are proposed to be retained are in quite good condition, which is one of the reasons why not only can they stay, but they can be structurally integrated into the new building. So those buildings will be completely restored inside and out. Exterior wise, we're actually not going to make a ton of changes because we do want to maintain the existing look. So restoration to windows, a big question was actually windows in those existing buildings and whether or not they should be replaced or if they should be maintained, because there's some pretty beautiful stained glass and leaded windows in some of those buildings. The ultimate decision was to retain those and to restore them, as well as some of the other wood features on those buildings. So the inside, of course, will be completely renovated in order to accommodate the residents' use.
But part of the site preparation and those other two buildings, they'll be demolished.
All buildings except for the two to be retained will be demolished, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further hands, I will we'll go back into the committee, and the motion is now on the floor. Seeing no other comments or hands, I will call the question. All those in favor? And opposed? Seeing none, the site plan recommendation is now passed. I want to thank everybody for having a very civil evening on a fairly contentious issue, and I appreciate that. So going back to the agenda, if I can find it. All right. Here we go. Motions. Seeing none. Notices of motion. Any other business? Seeing none. There are two correspondence that were added as well as on our addendum, which we've recognized. Date and time of the next meeting will be Thursday, July 9th at our usual 6:30 p.m. Looking for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hill, Councillor Kiley, Vice Chair Kiley. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much, and good night.